Hey dudes, I'm back with another set review, and we are at Antiquities, which is an awesome set for a few reasons. It certainly has some shortcomings, as all sets do, but this is the first set that attempts to tell its own story, and it's a pretty awesome story, depending on which source you get your lore from. I planned on adding an overview where I briefly went over the lore, but that brief overview turned into a script that looks like this. So I just made it its own video. If you're interested in the lore of the Brothers' War and never read the book by Jeff Grubb, that video is a decent place to get much of that information. So this video will focus on the set and the cards themselves. I'll be talking about these cards mostly based on how they would function in a limited environment, such as a cube or draft. But some cards have a more impressive pedigree than others, so if a card is super good, I'll probably talk about where and why that might be. Before I get to the cards though, I'll go over pack anatomy and how many of these cards you would need if you decided to put together a historically accurate draft of this set. Antiquities has 85 cards in total, or 100 if you include the art variations found on 5 of the lands. Otherwise, this set is set up much like Arabian Nights. Antiquities had two sheets, a common sheet and an uncommon sheet. These sheets were 11 by 11, like Limited, Unlimited, and Arabian Nights. For the common sheet, cards were either C1, C2, or C4, representing that they appeared on the sheet either once, twice, or 4 times, respectively. I'll talk about each card's rarity while I'm talking about that card, but as you can tell by looking at the screen, I'm also displaying the information here for convenience. The way these sheets are broken down means that some of these cards are 4 times as likely to appear than some of the other cards, and others still are only twice as likely, or half as likely as the previous cards. The common sheet has a similar approach, with cards appearing either once, twice, or 3 times, or U1, U2, or U3, respectively. Each pack held 8 cards, 6 of those being off of the common sheet, and the other 2 cards coming from the uncommon sheet. If you wanted to build yourself draft packs that included every card and had the same pull odds as the original packs, you would need roughly 60 packs, but you would have 4 cards left over. That's because each sheet had 121 cards on it, being an 11 by 11 sheet. And for every uncommon sheet, there would have been 3 common sheets. In order to fill these packs, you would need 1 copy of each U1, 2 copies of each U2, 3 copies of each U3, but you would need 3 copies of each C1, 6 copies of each C2, and of course 12 copies of each C4. This would leave you with 484 cards, which again would fill 60 packs with 4 cards left over. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the cards themselves. If you're interested in a specific section of cards, I have timestamps that will get you closer. So, let's begin with the white cards. Argivian Archaeologist is actually pretty good in a limited environment. At least this limited environment, because gosh golly, there are a lot of artifacts. In this set, 44 of the 85 cards are artifacts, and for the first time in Magic's history, a decent chunk of them are common, with 10 of those artifacts being at C4. So if you did play a limited of this set, there would be artifacts around, which is a really good thing, because if all the artifacts were uncommons, this set would be dog water to try and draft. But back to the card, this is a pretty sweet effect. 2 white mana to return an artifact to your hand, that's decent, especially in a limited environment. And especially in this limited environment, where there are only 3 cards that can kill this. One's a C4, but the other 2 are a U3 and U1. But other than pingers, there isn't any actual creature removal in this set. And with that said, Artifact removal is pretty common, so you'd have reason to use this. The art was illustrated by Amy Weber, and I really like it. I don't think it's a great piece from a technical standpoint, but the night sky is so beautiful, and I really like the shading on the archaeologist's hair. From a flavor standpoint, this is pretty sick as well. The Argivians were the most technologically advanced people on the continent of Tertiaire, and that was in no small part due to the vast wealth of ancient Thrawn artifacts found within their lands. The power and convenience granted by these ancient machines led to a culture that respected and encouraged archaeology. Much of the noble class found it distasteful, but the benefits were obvious enough that many archaeologists had no trouble securing funding. So, yeah, from a lore perspective, this card hits pretty hard. As the archaeologists thrived by the need to acquire more artifacts, so too did the blacksmiths. Required to adapt and modify the old technologies into practical pieces of technology to assist with the day-to-day life. So, like Argivian Archaeologist, this card is pretty flavorful. Unlike Argivian Archaeologist, Argivian Blacksmith is a C4, making it very common, as 4 copies of this card appeared on the common sheet. Argivian Blacksmith costs 1 and 2 white mana, but it is a 2/2 for the trouble. You can tap the Blacksmith to prevent the next 2 damage that would be dealt to target artifact. I will say, this is fairly niche, but there are a large number of artifact creatures in this set, so in this limited, this card actually has some room to shine. It's not a non-zero effect by any means, and you may find that it is far more annoying than you expect it could ever be, when you have some artifact creature and your opponent has 1 or 2 of these lying around. There isn't much to say about this strategically. You just tap it to prevent your most valuable things from dying when 2 damage prevented would prevent them from dying. How common that is will definitely vary, and I don't think this card has a place in Constructed unless you just really vibe with this dude. But in Draft or Cube, this dude has some room to shine. Overall, it's a solid card for what it is, but nothing to write home about. This art was illustrated by Kirsten Kama, which is a name you'll hear 3 times in this video and then probably not ever again, as they did only 3 pieces in this set, then never did another card for Magic. I know nothing about this person, because most of what I could find from a Google search was just the name. There was this one Reddit post that vaguely implied they died, but I couldn't find anything substantial either way. The art is really cool though. I really like the style, even though the arms are different lengths. Sorry, I saw this, you gotta see it. It is a really sweet piece though. Artifact Ward costs a single white mana and is an aura that keeps a creature from being blocked, damaged, or even targeted by artifact sources. It's interesting that the only thing that's preventing this from just being protection from artifacts is that equipment didn't exist when this card was made. So that's kind of neat. You could equip something with Artifact Ward attached to it, if for some reason you ever found the need to do that. It's a C4 rarity, making it a common, and it would be pretty useful in a draft. There are 2 or 3 ways for an artifact to deal damage to a creature, depending on if it has flying or not. So this could potentially have some use. And pretty much every deck will have artifact creatures, so some of the time, in some situations, it would basically read as making something unblockable, which is pretty good and limited. It's a fine card, but again, nothing crazy. It's also interesting to note that you can enchant artifact creatures with this. Anyway, that's really all I have for this. It was illustrated by Douglas Schuler, and I really enjoy this piece. It seems Douglas Schuler has gotten better at drawing faces, and the magical details here are really sick. I vibe with the style. Oh boy, it's another Circle of Protection. How very cool. The art is sick as fuck, though. Anyway, COP artifacts cost 1 and a white mana and is an enchantment that sticks around. You can pay 2 to prevent the next source of damage to you by an artifact. I like the extra text on this card that says if a source deals damage to you more than once a turn, you must pay the 2 each time. Which is text I can only presume is written on this card because Rocket Launcher exists. And Triskelion, I guess. I'm generally not a fan of Circle of Protections, but this one is especially pretty awful. There's not a single way in the entire set to remove Circle of Protection, or any of the other 9 enchantments in this set. There isn't even any counter magic that can prevent it from coming down. If they have the mana in this card, this thing is coming down and it's staying down. And the only thing you can do about it is to hit them in the face. A lot. And hopefully with multiple things. Or at least something that isn't an artifact. Although, this card isn't completely toxic. It's a U3 rarity, which is the most common uncommon. But at least it isn't a common. So you very well might see it, but you won't see it often. It also doesn't stop everything, and while it is annoying, you can definitely beat down past it some amount of the time anyway. It's wild because I think I might snap grab this in a draft if only to deny it to my opponents. As far as constructed goes, unless your meta has some level of consistent artifact threat, this card doesn't do much. Maybe you could justify it in Swedish with all the Suchi running around, but no, I don't think so. Oh yeah, did I mention the art was sick? Because the art is fucking sick. This is the first time I've said that a card was illustrated by Pete Venters, but it is far from the last. Cool art, annoying card, probably decent card. Dampening Field is an enchantment that costs 2 and a white mana, and when it's in play, players can't untap more than 1 artifact during their untap step. Luckily, this is another U3 rarity, because holy shit does this make for some boring ass fuck games. If you were to make 60 packs of this set to draft, 185 cards would be artifacts. That's less than half, but not by much. Every deck is going to be artifacts, because every card in the set references artifacts in some way. So even if you did manage a pile of cards without a single artifact, your deck would probably struggle to do anything of value. Dampening Field is an enchantment and can't be removed by any card in this set, so if it hits, it sits. And it's likely to at least moderately cripple your opponent, and probably you. That being said, if you build your deck right, and get somewhat lucky, this card goes hard. As far as constructed goes, in most situations, a card like this is way too niche to ever see anything but a sideboard. Maybe you could justify it in Commander if you're not running artifacts and your pod runs ass tons of artifact ramp. But really, this card sucks. At least until it's good. Then it's pretty good. That being said, it is brutal in an environment that can't remove it and is more than a third artifacts. The art is pretty cool too. The dagger is the stupidest dagger I've ever seen, but I like the choice in hues, and the saturation kinda goes hard. Justin Hampton illustrated this card, and I dig it. Oh hey, it's a card with lore we can talk about. Martyrs of Corliss costs 3 and 2 white mana. It's a 1/6 creature that redirects damage by artifacts from you to this creature, as long as it's untapped. So yeah, this kinda sucks. It sucks less in an environment with decent selection of artifact creatures, as well as some artifacts capable of dealing direct damage. But against the artifact creatures that are attacking, the ability kind of means nothing because you could just block. But I suppose this can sort of block all artifact creatures by taking the damage, which is pretty cool. It can also make it way harder to kill you with a rocket launcher, and Triskelion can't get through unless it comes at you as a 4/4, then pops 2 counters afterwards to kill the martyr. So this card definitely has uses, and you can stack it with Dampening Field and or Circle of Protection artifact to be a real cunt. The game will probably end with decking because this will be tough to get through. So this is definitely fine in draft, but I do hate how expensive this is. The whole taking damage for you as a bodyguard is certainly flavorful, which helps with the card. And like Dampening Field, you aren't likely to see it a bunch because it's a U3 rarity, but you'll see it often enough to be annoyed by it. It is far less of an annoying card without Dampening Field or Circle of Protection artifacts running around, so there is that. And it's a super flavorful card. In the Brothers' War, the Martyrs of Corliss were a group of young rebels who rose up against Mishra's control of the region and got themselves killed, which in turn propagated the desire for freedom and kickstarted the liberation of Yosha. Overall, this is a cool card, and the art is pretty sweet too. This is the first card I've talked about that was illustrated by Margaret Organ Keene, and unfortunately it's misspelled on this card. This isn't my favorite of Margaret's pieces, but it's certainly not bad. I think the checkered pattern in the background kind of takes away from it for me, but I do love the symmetry of the piece. I'd hate it if every card had symmetrical based art, but I do enjoy it on the rare occasion. The last card we have to talk about is Reverse Polarity. For 2 white mana, you get an instant that gains you X life, where X is twice the damage dealt to you so far this turn by artifacts. Or, to put it another way, all damage done to you so far this turn by artifacts is retroactively added to your life total instead of subtracted. Further damage this turn is treated normally. So this card would be pretty decent if it was all damage, but if that were the case, white might actually be unkillable in this limited environment. As it stands, it's still pretty annoying, and honestly, if you see your opponent drop a plains, you might as well just plan to drop their life total with anything but artifacts, because you are going to have a hell of a time trying to get through. Like a lot of the hyper-specific to only artifact cards in this set, this one falters if you're trying to take it into Constructed. I don't even know what problem you would be solving with this card. Surely any deck that was trying to dome you with Rocket Launcher would just, like, Brain Geyser or Fireball you instead, right? I mean, I guess if you don't want to take 4 damage from a Suchi and you lost all your copies of Swords to Plowshares in a Volcano, I can see a use case for this. But no, this card sucks. It's a C4, so in a draft you would see this shit a decent amount, and in a draft it might even kick you in the dick. A bit. But otherwise this card is not going to ever be relevant. The art is pretty hysterical though. I do enjoy the less serious nature of it. Justin Hampton illustrated this piece. Drafna's Restoration is a sorcery that costs a single blue mana. It allows you to take any number of artifacts of your choice from target player's graveyard and place them on top of that player's library, in any order. This is a pretty sweet card. It's really good with Black Lotus, but what isn't? It's also fairly flexible in what you do with it, as long as what you're doing with it is moving artifacts to the top of a library. But you can use this on yourself to put artifacts that are useful to you on top of your library, or you can use it to put artifacts that are not so useful on top of your opponent's library, thus messing with their next few draws. And that's about it for the strategic complexity of this card, but it is pretty useful. At least in an Antiquities limited environment. This could have some use in Constructed, but that's realistically only a good idea if you'd use it on yourself most of the time. It's a bad idea to build your game plan around your opponents maybe doing something. Drafna's Restoration is a C4 rarity, so you're going to see it a decent amount. And while it's cheeky, it's not going to be a card that makes you piss and shit yourself when it gets dropped. Like, it can definitely be annoying, but this is hardly the most oppressive card in the set. From a lore perspective, it's pretty neat too. As the card's flavor text says, Drafna was a founder of the College of Latinown, which existed on an island to the west of Teresier, and because of its relative distance from the brothers and their squabbling, Drafna wanted little to do with the war, and was even against joining the Union of the Third Path until Herkel, Drafna's wife, convinced him that they needed to help. The art is absolutely fabulous on this piece as well. The night sky looks fantastic, and the foliage is well done. Amy Weber illustrated this card, and I'm an enjoyer of this piece. Up next is Energy Flux, and this card is going to be annoying to deal with. Mainly because you can't deal with it in this set. Energy Flux is an enchantment that costs 2 and a blue. While this enchantment is in play, all artifacts require an upkeep cost of 2 in addition to any other upkeep costs they may have. Sacrifice each artifact whose upkeep isn't paid. So, to start with, this is symmetrical, which does go a long way to balancing it out, especially in the limited environment of this set. It'll at least discourage people from slapping this bad boy down without a thought. Remember, it affects you as well, and there is no way to remove an enemy enchantment. Notice the word enemy there because it is possible to remove your own enchantments in this set, but that isn't likely to happen. There's only one card I can think of that does it, and it's expensive and bad. The point is, in a limited where over half the cards are artifacts, and every card interacts with an artifact in some way, this is a dangerous piece to be dropping without a game plan. So, use Energy Flux responsibly. It's a U3 rarity, so it's not going to be every game you see something like this, but it is common enough you should be cognizant of its power. It's an alright meta call in Constructed if your deck synergizes with enchantments, but there is also removal that can deal with this in Constructed, so it's going to be less impactful there, even in situations where it does something. The art is just okay. It's fine, but it doesn't really resonate with me. It was illustrated by Kaja Folio, and I really like Kaja's work, but most of it I like better than this piece. Hurkyl's Recall is an instant that costs 1 and a blue and it returns all artifacts that target player owns to their hand. While it's not really relevant in this limited, it is important to note this says artifacts that are owned, not artifacts that are controlled. So if you steal someone's artifact, then play this, that artifact will go to their hand, despite being on your board. It also won't bounce artifacts they stole from you to your hand. Just a neat little detail to point out. Now that that's out of the way, this card is pretty cracked. It suffers from the same problem most of Antiquities suffers from in Constructed. Like, if your opponent isn't playing artifacts, this does nothing. But in Limited, that's obviously not a problem. And I would also say this is pretty bonkers in Commander, depending on your pod. It blows up treasures, and usually at least one player will be slamming artifacts. You can, of course, also use it to trigger Enters triggers if you have cheap artifacts and something that benefits from you casting artifacts. So this is a pretty solid card in less competitive games. In Limited, this can be pretty brutal, especially if you hit someone's high-costed artifacts. Bouncing isn't as great as destroying, until it is, so be wary of this card. But not too wary of this card, because it is a U1 rarity, meaning only one of these per uncommon sheet, so it would be incredibly unlikely for more than one of these to even be in a draft, and almost impossible for more than one to be used in the same deck. Which is probably for the best, because this card is super impactful. From a lore perspective, this card is super sick. Hurkyl, along with her husband Drafna, were representatives from the College of Latnam in Teresa City, founding place of the Union of the Third Path. During the Brothers' War, very few people actually understood that magic was a real thing, and Hurkyl's meditation techniques proved valuable to teaching the realm about magic. During Mishra's siege of Teresia City, members of the cult, the Brotherhood of Gix, had infiltrated Teresia and threw open the doors, dooming the city to be razed. During this, Hurkyl went out and did her magic to disappear Mishra's dragon engines, which were a major component of his assault force. Unfortunately, while she could disappear the machines, her magic did nothing to the human soldiers, and she got stabbed to death by spears. During her life, Hurkyl was incredibly quiet and rarely spoke, letting her husband do the blithering and talking. So her discoveries were often attributed to Drafna, but she didn't seem to care. This card is really cool from both a mechanical and lore perspective, and the art slaps hard. I'm a big fan of this piece. The shading in her hair is especially awesome, and those tattoos are dope. Even the little details, like the wax drippings off the candles, are top notch. However, I have no clue how to pronounce this name. Nene Thomas illustrated this, and I'm sorry if I butchered that. Sick art, though. Next up is a big boy that likely needs no introduction. Power Artifact costs 2 blue mana for an aura enchantment that can be attached to artifacts. It reduces the activation cost of non-mana abilities by 2, but it can't reduce a cost to less than 1. So, this card is really good. In Constructed, this is usually used to make infinite mana by combining it with Grim Monolith or Basalt Monolith, because the untap abilities are not mana abilities. In a limited environment, you aren't going to be doing anything near that broken, but there are quite a few artifacts with activated abilities in this set. The most bang for your buck you'd probably get is by attaching this to either a dragon engine or a rocket launcher. Both of those abilities cost 2, so you'd only be lowering them by 1, but the difference between 1 and 2 on an ability that you'll use more than once is a lot. A lot of the artifacts kinda suck, but many of them do have activated abilities you'll use more than once, even if it's not more than once per turn. An effect like this can definitely put in a lot of work, and the only way they are dealing with this is by dealing with the artifact, since there isn't enchantment removal. Don't get too excited though, there is a decent amount of artifact removal. Either way, this card is pretty sweet, even in a limited environment, but it does shine brightest in Constructed. Power Artifact is a U3 rarity, and probably one of the better cards in this set, in Constructed, and just kind of good in a limited environment. You could definitely do far worse, but without the infinite combos, it's more suited as a late game threat enchantment piece than a combo piece, which is probably a more healthy place for the card to sit, all things considered. The art is pretty fire on this piece, too. Douglas Schuler illustrated this one, and it's pretty awesome. It's one of those iconic pieces, and I love the depth that's implied through the shading. It's a very cool piece. Next up is a more simple card, with Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a sorcery that costs a single blue mana, and it simply returns an artifact to your hand from the graveyard. This is a pretty good card. It's cheap, it's efficient, and for the most part, it's pretty honest. You still need to cast the artifact you grab, so as long as it's not broken, this card isn't broken. It just trades itself for an artifact that was removed. There isn't much to say about this. It's solid and limited, and you can do some wacky stuff with it in Constructed, but you need your deck to care about artifacts. It's really common too, being a C4 rarity. But I guess we can talk about the most interesting part about this card. It wasn't printed with a set symbol. That's fairly interesting on its own, but what's really interesting about this is it suggests that they changed how they did the set symbol. In Arabian Nights, to mark the cards with the set symbol, they used a process called step and repeat to mark the black plates with the symbol. I don't really understand the process that well, but for Arabian Nights, the symbol had to be black and it had to be identical. The rest of what I'll say about this is just my assumptions, so take that with a grain of salt. But Reconstruction appeared on the common sheet in 4 places, and none of them have the set symbol. As far as I understand it, the plates weren't individual cards, but rather whole sheets, or possibly quadrants. This would mean the step and repeat process would have been messed up multiple times, but only for one card, which appears super unlikely. So odds are that the set symbols were added to the card file before the separations were made, which isn't an absurd idea. It would likely save production time and money doing it this way, and it would explain why none of the reconstructions have set symbols, since the image was likely copy-pasted into its positions on the card sheet. I always kind of just assumed that the process for Antiquities was the same as it was for Arabian Nights, because the sets are organized similarly, but it does make sense that they were continually optimizing the process, and Reconstruction just happened to be hit by a snag in those optimization processes. I guess that's really all I have to say on this card. It is the first piece on this set that we've talked about that was illustrated by Anson Maddox, and like much of his work, this piece is also fantastic. The yellow and green is an interesting choice that doesn't sit with me fully, but the details of the piece are awesome. Overall, I do like this art. Up next is Sage of Latnam, the only blue creature in this set. Sage of Latnam costs 1 and a blue and is a 1/2 human artificer that can tap and sack an artifact to draw a card. This is an interesting card in that it kind of sucks, but it kind of feels like it could be good. This card doesn't provide card advantage unless you generate artifact tokens and sack those, but I think the only way to generate artifact tokens in this specific set is by casting a Tetravis, moving the +1/+1 counters off Tetravis, and turning them into 1/1 flying artifact creatures that you could then sack to Sage of Latnam to draw cards, thus netting card advantage. But that's a lot of hoops to draw some cards that will probably suck. You could also sack an artifact creature that was blocking before the damage step to draw a card, thus preventing damage and gaining a resource back, but I highly doubt that was a legal play back in the day. especially with the text mentioning that this can't be done to artifacts on the way to their graveyard. You'd have a hard time convincing most opponents that this was an okay play, at any rate. All this to say that this card is fine, but not great. It's nice to cycle your garbage artifacts unlimited, but you have to cast them first. So if those garbage artifacts cost more than 2, you're way overpaying on what is effectively cycling with extra steps. You can probably do some bullshit with this in Constructed, but I'd be surprised to learn that the hoops that you set up would be worth the effort when you could just, like, fireball someone or hit them in the face with a Suchi 5 times. Sage of Latnam is a C4, so you will see it a decent amount, and it's not the worst blocker in the world with its 2 toughness, so it definitely has a place, but it is a tricky card to use properly. The art is super sick on this bad boy as well. Pete Venters illustrated this, and as with most of his pieces, this one is incredibly well done. Well, we're at the last of the blue cards, and it's a banger of a card. Another big boy that's arguably one of the best cards in the set that isn't a land. Transmute Artifact is a sorcery that costs 2 blue mana. When you cast this spell, you must sacrifice an artifact, then you search your library for an artifact card. If that artifact's mana value is less than or equal to the sacrificed artifact, you put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, you may pay X, where X is the difference in mana value. If you don't, put the searched artifact into the graveyard. You also have to shuffle after searching your library, but that probably goes without saying. So first off, it's pretty wild that Fix Tinker came out before Tinker did, but beyond that, Transmute Artifact is an awesome card. In a draft, there aren't any insanely game-winning artifacts that would make it an obvious target. But there are a lot of artifacts, and some of them are even worth tutoring out. This card's ceiling is obviously much higher in Constructed, and I'm pretty sure this still sees play in some of the Constructed formats. I know some CEDH Urza lists played it, at least. In Constructed, this is likely to be used for some combo or another, but in Limited, you're pretty much forced to play it fairly. Even playing this card fairly is significantly better than not playing it, especially in such an artifact-heavy set. Transmute Artifact has a rarity of U3, making it a fairly common uncommon, and the art is absolutely phenomenal. Like, this is peak Magic artwork in my opinion. It's nonsensical, it's got the old art vibe I love so much, and the art leaves little room for guesswork as to which card this is. It's truly breathtaking in my opinion. Anson Maddox illustrated this piece and just blew it out of the water in my opinion. I love this piece so much. And I love this card on top of that. It's truly one of the greatest of all time. But that's it for the blue cards, so let's keep trucking into the black cards, which are especially interesting because before this set, and for a long time after this set, black didn't really mess with artifacts. After so many years of Magic cards being released, pretty much every color has messed with everything to some degree, but these cards kind of stand out as being especially interesting and unique for a long time. But let's get to them, shall we? We're starting with Artifact Possession, an aura that enchants artifacts that costs 2 and a black mana. Whenever enchanted artifact is tapped or its activated ability is activated, Artifact Possession deals 2 damage to that artifact's controller. So this is a pretty simple card. It's next to useless in Constructed, and it does a lot in a set where every card is an artifact or deals with artifacts. Also, there's no enchantment removal in this set. So dealing with this requires dealing with the artifact it's enchanted to, but at that point it would just be better to never use it again. Either way, it's a good value for you. At 3 mana, Artifact Possession is also relatively cheap. This card isn't anything special, but it can absolutely put pressure on your opponent in a way that a lot of these cards simply can't. And get used to seeing this card too, because it's a C4 rarity, so you're very likely to see this. The art is pretty sweet on this card too. It's illustrated by the late great Christopher Rush, and it's far from my favorite of his pieces, but it's still very cool and flavorful. I do like the idea of a little demon possessing a piece of equipment and just slashing at you. Gate to Phyrexia is a wonderfully interesting card for a few different reasons. It's flavorful. It's a really unique effect as far as I know, and it's a pretty useful effect as well. Although it may be less useful in a set where every card deals with artifacts and any removal also deals with artifacts. Gate to Phyrexia is an enchantment that costs 2 black mana. While it's on the field, you can sacrifice a creature to destroy target artifact. The downside is that you can only activate this during your upkeep and only once each turn. That's still pretty good. There are a lot of use cases for an enchantment like this. If this card was more widely available, I suspect it would see a decent amount of play in higher level commander games. It probably can't hang in CEDH, but I've never seen it attempted, so who's to say? Overall, it's pretty good trading your worst creature for their best artifact, assuming you have the creature to sacrifice. Lore-wise, this is cool because a big part of the Brothers' War was the subtle machinations perpetuated by the Phyrexian Gix to achieve his own ends. And Gix's reintroduction to Dominaria was caused by the brothers unwittingly opening the gate to Phyrexia when they broke the Power Stone that became the Might and Weak Stones. So this is a cool card for sure. The art is pretty awesome too. Gate to Phyrexia was illustrated by Sandra Everingham, and in my opinion, this is one of her better pieces. Up next is Haunting Wind, and while this card isn't really dripping in lore or anything, it is a pretty sweet card. Haunting Wind is an enchantment that costs 3 and a black mana. When this is in play, each time an artifact is tapped or its activation cost is paid, Haunting Wind deals 1 damage to that artifact's controller. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it's basically just a global version of artifact possession. Kind of seems weird that they ran out of ideas for black cards, considering there are only 7 black cards in the whole set, but despite the shade I'm throwing at this card, I don't hate it. It's notable that this affects all artifacts in play, including your own, so make sure to take that into account before playing it. It's also less common than artifact possession, being a U3 rarity, which is probably for the best. Too many affects all artifacts in a set that's all artifacts is probably going to muddy the game experience beyond recognition. And like I said before, it suffers from being just a bit too niche to see constructed play. It is also pretty heavily costed, but I wouldn't say overcosted. Overall, it's a fine card and limited, but not impressive. The art is pretty sick though. Haunting Wind was illustrated by Jeff A. Menges. Next up, we have a creature. Phyrexian Gremlins is a 1/1 that costs 2 and a black. You can tap Phyrexian Gremlins to tap target artifact. That artifact doesn't untap as normal as long as Phyrexian Gremlins is tapped. Also, you can choose not to untap Phyrexian Gremlins at your upkeep. So this is a pretty simple card that's a bit overcosted, but still kind of useful. It's interesting in this limited environment because other than a few pingers in this set, there isn't anything that can deal with this. So in some situations, it could be a pretty permanent solution to a problem you have. Interestingly, there is one artifact creature that gets around this, but most of the artifacts in this set kind of just fold to this. It is a C4 rarity, so you'll see it pretty often. It's also not good in constructed, though that's probably obvious. The art is pretty cool as well. They've disassembled what appears to be an Armageddon clock in this art, which is pretty flavorful and a cool shout out. Amy Weber illustrated this piece and did well with it. It's very whimsical and fun. It's another creature. Black got a lot of creatures in this set. Priest of Yawgmoth is a very interesting card with a very interesting and unique effect. For 1 and a black, you get a 1/2 Phyrexian Human Cleric. You can tap Priest of Yawgmoth and sacrifice an artifact to add an amount of black mana equal to the sacrificed creature's mana value. This is a very interesting effect. In the limited environment, there is limited use to this thing. You can't really cheat out bigger things to cheat on mana, but you can sack artifacts that are no longer useful to you to cast. Well, mostly more artifacts. In constructed, depending on the card pool, you could cheat out some big dumb artifact for a juicy drain life, but really this piece doesn't really do enough to justify the hoops. Or rather, the pieces needed to make this really good just don't really exist, at least not in older card pools. Still, this is a very interesting and cool card. You could definitely do some nonsense with it if you tried hard enough, and it's still pretty good and limited, all things considered. And you can do some really funny stuff with it. Colossus of Sardia is a card we'll talk about later that's notable for being really bad, but if you manage to get it down and swing with it, you could then just sack it to a Priest of Yawgmoth to get your 9 mana back. So that's pretty neat. But that is a pretty extreme example of what you could do with this card. I really like this card, and I think it should probably see more experimental play, but it's definitely not top tier and probably not even mid tier in any competitive meta. There is also a pile of lore on this card. So this Priest of Yawgmoth is a representative of the Brotherhood of Gix, a group of monks in Teresier that worshipped machines and Phyrexia. The Brotherhood of Gix is a very mysterious and secretive group, but they were the ones to travel to the Cave of Kolios long after the splitting of the Weak and Might Stones and reopened the gate to Phyrexia to allow Gix to return to the plane of Dominaria. The Brotherhood of Gix then acted as spies for Gix and infiltrated every organization of any influence in the war and quietly gathered intelligence. They became especially ingratiated into Mishra's court and steered Mishra into ruin. They also replaced their body parts with machinery, though the level of modification varied, and those of the Brotherhood of Gix in Urza's court had to refrain from modifications at all to keep their cover. So yeah, big pile of lore in a unique card with a good but not great effect, and all of that topped off by what is an awesome piece of art, illustrated by Mark Teeden. Truly, it's an amazing card. Oh yeah, this card is a C4 rarity, so you'll see it a lot too. I forgot to mention that. Up next is Genetic Poltergeist, a 1/1 spirit that costs 1 and 2 black mana. You can tap Genetic Poltergeist to turn a non-creature artifact into an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value. This card is a U3 rarity, and it's pretty solid and limited. You can probably do some funny stuff with this in Constructed with the wider card pool, but you'd mostly be trolling. But in Limited, this could help give you some heavy-hitting power if you just need a bit more to get over the finish line, or you want to clobber your opponent's board. Overall, this is an interesting card, but it's not really a good card. Again, you can do some funny stuff with this, and its value in Limited might just be turning your bad artifacts into at least some value. I do really enjoy the art for this card, though. Genetic Poltergeist was illustrated by Dan Frazier, and while there is a lot of his artwork I love, this kind of has a different vibe, at least to most of his work in the sets that came before. I like the natural progression of his art, and this piece has a fun little scene. I like cards that tell a story with their art. And we're to the last of our black cards. Yawgmoth Demon is a whopping 6/6 flyer with first strike that costs 4 and 2 black mana, for a total mana value of 6. In order to keep this demon sated, you must sacrifice an artifact each turn. If you don't, you must tap Yawgmoth Demon and it deals 2 damage to you. This powerhouse is a View 1 rarity, making this card pretty damn rare, but it's honestly a pretty solid creature by the standards of the time. Having to sack your artifacts down is pretty brutal and probably too much of a cost for this to see serious Constructed play, but in a set where there is no creature removal and everything is either an artifact or probably kind of garbage, this card can go the distance. Flying is amazing in this draft specifically because it's fairly rare, and first strike is stupid good in this environment. Being the 6/6 is also relevant because there is really only one creature that can handle this without jumping through some hoops. This is a very cool card and one I'd be happy to play. It's also a pretty lore-filled card too, because Yawgmoth Demon is a representation of Gix, a Phyrexian demon and praetor from Phyrexia. Well, technically not from Phyrexia, as Gix was originally a human that was part of the Thrawn Empire, but that was 500 years ago, and not really part of this story. Gix himself was made aware of the happenings on Teresier when the brothers broke the Power Stone and unwittingly opened a portal to Phyrexia. For some reason that I don't really understand, he and Mishra were connected somehow, as both would dream of the other for years. starting almost immediately after the splitting of the weak and might stones. Gix yearned for the power of the stones, and felt the desire to punish Mishra for stealing from Phyrexia, for the dragon engines, responsible for the first scrap of Mishra's power, were Phyrexian in origin. Gix would play an integral part of how the war played out, influencing his cult to twist events and people, and he would come exceptionally close to getting what he wanted when Urza blew everything up and Gix had to return back to Phyrexia. So yeah, another very cool card with a lot of lore and story within it. The art is also pretty awesome. I very much enjoy this piece. It was illustrated by Sandra Everingham. I just really love the old Magic card art. It's so full of personality. But that's the last of the black cards, many of which were creatures. So let's go ahead and move on to the red cards, which are a fun and eclectic set of cards, with a couple that are especially fun to talk about. So let's get into the red cards. First up is Artifact Blast, a red interrupt, or instant rather, that costs a single red mana and counters an artifact. And this baby is a C4, so you are going to see copies of this around. I like this card. It's not necessarily a popular opinion, but I like efficient removal, and I also enjoy 1 mana niche counterspells, especially in colors other than blue. Nothing against blue, I love those counterspells too, but non-blue counterspells just hit different. Artifact Blast is definitely niche. I could see some sideboard use in Constructed if you may be facing a deck with Artifact win cons or playing against power because Artifact blasting a Black Lotus is like fucking tits or whatever else dumps dopamine into your brain wrinkles. This card is especially good in this limited though, and I really don't think I need to tell you why. It counters artifacts in a set that's over half artifacts. I like this card, and the art is pretty cool too. It's definitely nothing special, but it's solid, and I enjoy it. Artifact Blast was illustrated by Mark Poole. Up next is one of the coolest and also strongest cards in this set, Atog. Okay, don't laugh. This card hasn't really scaled as well as some of the other really powerful cards, but in a time you could play the Power 9 and other insanely good cheap artifacts, man, pair this dude with a balance or two, and the Moxes, and you have yourself a beast of a deck. Hell, Atog is banned in Pauper. That's gotta count for something. And also, get yourself an Ornithopter and an Enduring Renewal, and you can get this dude stronger than a cactus the internet won't shut up about. Oh yeah, I forgot to explain the card. Atog is a 1/2 creature that costs 1 and a red mana. You can sacrifice an artifact to give Atog +2/+2 until end of turn. It doesn't have Trample or Menace or Invasion, which would really help this card out, but it's still good enough. I don't think Atog necessarily has the support pieces it needs to do super well in this limited environment. True, the environment has more artifacts than you can shake a stick at, but it doesn't really have support it needs to clear a path for your opponent's life total. While the lack of creature removal helps Atog survive, it does limit his ability to hit face. Overall, Atog is an awesome card, and one of the better cards in the set, but it may not be able to perform that well in a draft. Or at least it wouldn't, but on the other hand, it's a C4 rarity, so you can maybe just cast another one if it fails to do the job. You're going to need a bunch more artifacts, though. Anyway, Atog was illustrated by Jesper Myrfors, and I love the art. The eyes are especially fantastic, but the whole piece just has a foreboding whimsy to it that I enjoy. Up next is Detonate. Detonate is a sorcery that costs X and a red mana. Destroy target artifact with mana value X. It can't be regenerated, and Detonate deals X damage to that artifact's controller. Now this is a spell that can help close games. Like many of the cards we've looked at, the nature of this set's obsession with artifacts leaves many of the cards being niche for the simple reason that many decks just don't play that many or any artifacts. I'd never run this in Constructed, but this piece is bonkers in this limited. It does have a rarity of U3, so I wouldn't worry too much about getting your face blown up multiple times, but it certainly could happen. But yeah, there isn't much to say about it. It's a great burn and removal option in this limited environment, but it's too niche to be of much use in the wider environment of Constructed. The art is absolutely wicked, though. I love this piece. It's got such a sharp contrast, and the details are surprisingly vivid. Overall, this art is better than the card it wrote in on, and the artist's name was misspelled, unfortunately. Randy Asplinfaith, illustrated Detonate. Up next is Dwarven Weaponsmith, a 1/1 dwarf artificer that costs 1 and a red. During your upkeep only, you can tap this and sacrifice an artifact to add a +1/+1 counter onto a creature. So that's fairly decent. There are a couple creatures that would wear that +1/+1 pretty well, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a waste of resources in most situations. You can only do it once a turn, and it's only +1/+1, which makes this not particularly great. It definitely has some value, especially in this limited environment. I'm not even going to entertain this for Constructed. I wouldn't recommend building around this at all. Otherwise, this is just a 1/1. Luckily, you won't have to be disappointed by it too often because it's a U3 rarity, making it unlikely to come up often. The art is easily the best part of this card. Mark Poole illustrated it, and I really like this art. The background is especially captivating for whatever reason, but yeah, cool art. Oh yeah, I just realized there really isn't any lore in the red section, so I guess I can stretch this section out a bit here and talk about the dwarves of Teresier. So the dwarves lived in and around the Sardian Mountains and the Kolkhagen Mountains. There is so little I can tell you about the culture of these dwarves. I don't even know if the Kolkhagen and the Sardian dwarves hang out or like each other or are the same people. What I can tell you is that the Sardian dwarves were mostly slaughtered. They worked with the Three Kingdoms for a while, but eventually they wouldn't or couldn't capitulate to Urza's growing need for resources, and so they were cleared out, and then their resources were cleared out. I would assume the Kolkhagen mountain dwarves mostly survived. Mishra may have ravaged some of their lands, but as far as I can remember, there is no mention of the Kolkhagen dwarves getting slaughtered. Oh, I'm excited to talk about this card. Goblin Artisans is a 1/1 Goblin Artificer that costs a single red mana to cast. You can tap Goblin Artisans and flip a coin. If you win the flip, draw a card, and if you lose the flip, counter target artifact spell. Yeah, counter target artifact spell. So you can only activate this ability with an artifact on the stack that you cast. Basically, when you play an artifact, you can tap this and flip a coin. If you win the flip, you get to draw a card. Otherwise, you don't get the artifact. Oh, and you can't tap multiple Goblin Artisans per artifact. So this is a really interesting ability. It's not a good ability, until it is. But it is an interesting ability. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that this is a competitive dud. The upside is nice, especially in mono red, but flipping a coin just means you have a 50-50 chance of getting screwed. That's about 50% not consistent enough. Basically, randomness very rarely finds its way to the top tables. But in limited, or just playing for fun, this card slaps. Throwing this nonsense into your game can leave you with the highest highs and the lowest lows. So it's fun to play with. It's a fun card. It's not a serious card, but it is a hilarious card. It is an unlikely card to see, though, as it is a U3 rarity. The art is sublime. It's perfection incarnate. From the goblin eating glue to the one with his tongue drooping out as though he lacks the ability to concentrate on his book and maintain motor function of his mouth, to the look of resignated frustration and mild annoyance from the brutish injury he's likely endured before as he berates his coworker, who's eyeing the situation with the slightest hint of intrigue as though he were thinking profoundly on the critiques of his colleague. Almost to say, you know, Grubb might have a point here. The background itself is majestic. From the tugged apron to the hand carelessly penetrated by a nail, to the crumpled pile of wood ransacked together, to the large number 5 crudely painted under a sign with backwards letters stating "Our Goal." And don't get me started on the hard hats. Seriously, I love this art so much. It was illustrated by Julie Barrow, and this is my favorite piece of hers, I think. There are a couple others that are also really good, but I know this one brings me the most joy. Next up is Orcish Mechanics, a 1/1 orc creature that costs 2 and a red. You can tap Orcish Mechanics and sacrifice an artifact to deal 2 damage to any target. So, this goes super hard in Limited. I think you would need to have a reason to put your artifacts in the graveyard to run Orcish Mechanics in Constructed, but it's maybe decent there with the right setup. In Limited, however, this is one of the few ways to deal with creatures, and it deals with a lot of them, some of which are pretty crippling if left unchecked. It has a price to ping with this, since it costs an artifact, but in a set where artifacts are plentiful and creature removal is not, it might be worth the trade. On top of that, Orcish Mechanics are a C4 rarity, so they are as plentiful as a card can be. The art on this card is also pretty sweet. Pete Venters illustrated Orcish Mechanics, and I think it's fantastic. He's a very skilled artist. We're on to our last red card, Shatterstorm, a sorcery that costs 2 and 2 red mana. It simply destroys all artifacts in play. They can't be regenerated. This is just Artifact Wrath of God, and it's pretty good. It's an interesting puzzle to solve in this Limited. I mean, the answer is don't play artifacts, blow up their artifacts, then play artifacts, but there's a lot of nuance to that, and it might be pretty broadcasted that you're going to do that if you, well, broadcast it. It's also solid and constructed for what it is. It's a little niche, so probably sideboard material, if even that, but it's still a good card. It's also a simple card, pretty easy to understand what it does, and yet it's powerful. You won't have to worry constantly about this card though. It's a U1, so it's as rare as cards get in this set. It's a good card. Shatterstorm was illustrated by Mark Poole, and I really enjoy this. It doesn't have the violence or magnitude of other destruction cards, but there is an elegance in its place, and I appreciate different interpretations of an artifact getting blown up. I already have to look at an artifact getting blown up in practically every removal spell art, and I appreciate that this one is a bit different from the norm. I'm not sure what that liquid is, because it looks way too viscous with way too much surface tension to be wine, but I think it's pretty to look at and well painted, despite having strange water physics. And with that, we have reached the green cards. There is only 7 of each colored card in this set. I don't think I mentioned that yet. Anyways, we're on to the final color, so let's get started, shall we? We're starting with our Argothian Pixies, a 2/1 fairy that costs 1 and a green. Argothian Pixies cannot be blocked or damaged by artifact creatures. So this card shines a little bit in Limited. This set has a lot of artifacts, and many of the non-artifact creatures either die when blocking this or wouldn't want to block it anyway, what with many of them having better things to do. So this is a decent low-to-the-ground creature that can very likely contribute a decent amount of early game pressure. Argothian Pixies are a C4 rarity, and therefore very common. Other than that, there isn't much to say about this card. As for constructed, it's super matchup depending, and I generally would advise you not to bother. I guess we can talk a little bit about Argoth. Argoth is an island that's just southeastern of Teritiare. It's a lush and verdant land ruled by Titania and watched by Gaia. Urza's son crashes onto Argoth and sees it's full of lush forests and mineral-rich mountains. So he goes back to his dad, who sends over everything to start chopping it the fuck down. The Brotherhood of Gix learn this, and Gix informs Mishra through a proxy, and so Mishra sails over there with everything he has, and starts chopping it down from the other side. The whole place was a paradise of nature that was home to elves, pixies, tree folks, human druids, and all manner of nature lovers. But this was before the war between the two brothers made its way to Argoth. The art is pretty sick as well. Argothian Pixies was illustrated by Amy Weber. All of the green cards we're going to talk about today have to do with Argoth, because it's the place of nature, I guess. Anyway, Argothian Treefolk is a 3/5 that costs 3 and 2 green mana. Also, it can't be damaged by artifact sources. So this is a thing I've said for practically every card, but this is good in limited, but not good in constructed. Most of the artifact damage sources aren't good enough to justify play in constructed. In limited, this is a nice body with a relevant effect for 5 mana. It's not great, but it might be just not great enough to help you win. Also, it's a C4, so you're going to see it around. Better use it or figure out how you're going to deal with it. Argothian Treefolk was also illustrated by Amy Weber, and I don't really like this piece. Like, I can tell they are treefolk, but I just don't really see it. Up next is Citadel Druid, the card I took my channel name from. Citadel Druid is a 1/1 human druid that costs 1 and a green, and whenever an opponent casts an artifact spell, put a +1/+1 on Citadel Druid. So, that's pretty good if your opponent is casting artifacts. It's pretty not good if your opponent isn't casting artifacts. I think you can figure out the rest from there. I do like this card, but it is fairly uncommon as a U3 rarity, so don't expect to see a lot of it. The art is also pretty sweet. Jeff A. Menges illustrated Sentinel Druid, and it's pretty sick. The hill has a surprising depth to it, the shading is well done, and I really like the sky. The trees are nice too. But let's talk about Sentinel for a bit, as it was the only real city in Argoth, and it was pretty much right in the middle of Argoth. So, Citadel was what you'd call a capital city, but I don't really think the Argothian culture gave a fuck about any of that. Also, Citadel is just the word lunatic backwards, in case it seemed eerily familiar. Next up is the Humble Crumble. For a single green mana at instant speed, you can destroy target artifact. Its controller gains life equal to its mana value. That's pretty good. It's efficient. It's a C4, so super common. It hits over half the cards in the set. Like, you should just run this. In Constructed, it's a solid sideboard card as well if your meta contains often played artifacts that you struggle to win through. This is a short section because there really isn't much to say. It's just fantastic removal. You should run this if you can. The art is pretty decent as well. Jesper Meerfers illustrated this, and while it's nowhere near my favorite piece, I respect it. Gaia's Avenger is a potentially massive creature. It costs 1 and 2 green mana, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts your opponent controls. So that can be pretty good, unless your opponent isn't running a bunch of artifacts. Then it's not very good. If your opponent isn't sacrificing their artifacts or playing artifact creatures that can block this, and they're playing other artifacts, then this is a good card. But it might be hard to reach those goals. I like this card, and there are absolutely decks that'll just get bodied by this, but it's probably less than you'd expect when you think about the fact that the set's half artifacts. Luckily, Gaia's Avenger is a U1 rarity, so it's unlikely your opponent will be planning on you having it, unless they deduce that you drafted it. So it probably has some merit. If you're heavy in green, it's probably worth playing. There's some sweet lore around Gaia's Avenger, but we'll talk about it when we talk about another card that's also relevant. I can say that Gaia's Avenger came from Argoth, obviously, and was a last-ditch effort of Gaia to crush the invaders after Titania's supposed death. The art is super awesome on this piece. Pete Venters illustrated this, and the detailing is really impressive when you look at it. Up next is Power Leech, an enchantment that costs 2 green mana. When Power Leech is on the field, anytime an opponent taps an artifact or activates an ability of an artifact, you gain 1 life. So generally 1 life isn't great, and I don't really see a place for this card in Constructed, but in Limited, this has the potential to be super annoying. You'll gain a life whenever they attack with an artifact creature, and this completely shuts down things like Rocket Launcher, which deal 1 damage each time its ability is activated, so this probably has some merit. Luckily, this is a U3 rarity, so it won't be super common, which is for the best, I think. I don't think this card is necessarily good, and I also hesitate to call it toxic, but something tells me this would be annoying as hell to deal with. At the end of the day, it does just slow you down though. You can definitely win through it, so it's probably fine. If you're in green, it's probably worth playing, but I think I'd pick most of the other uncommons before I grabbed this. There are a couple uncommons that just completely suck though. The art on this is fine too, illustrated by the late great Christopher Rush. It's an interesting piece, but hardly one of his best works. And with that, we're on to the last of the green cards and the last of the colored cards. Finishing off our list is Titania's Song, an enchantment that costs 3 and a green. When Titania's Song is played, each non-creature artifact loses all abilities, and becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness each equal to its casting cost. If this enchantment leaves play, the effect continues until the end of turn. So this is an interesting card, but I wouldn't really worry about the last line in a limited environment, because there is nothing that can deal with enchantments in this set, so it isn't relevant. Which means if this gets played, that's just a new game rule. It's hard to say if this is good because it's really dependent on the game you find yourself in. The non-creature artifacts in this set have a casting cost that ranges from 1 to 6. So in limited, this won't kill anything, just make artifact creatures. There are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, this actually makes many of the artifacts better. At least in the context of the limited environment. So realistically, the best way to use this is if you have bigger artifacts than your opponent does. This doesn't do anything tricky like making artifacts easier to kill. All the removal in this set hits artifacts, and artifact creatures are artifacts, so that doesn't change anything. And the only 0-cost artifact in this set is a creature, so it's not affected, meaning you can't kill it with this. There are a couple of pretty devastating win conditions in the artifact section, like Armageddon Clock or Rocket Launcher, kind of. And there are some strong artifacts in this set, but most of them are not strong. So again, it's really nuanced. It's matchup specific. That's what I'll say here. This card probably has some of the lowest lows and some of the highest highs as far as how much value it can bring you in a game. It's a U3 rarity, so you'll maybe see it, but it won't be every game, or anything like that. I don't know. This one is pretty hard to rate, but I do think that's in its favor. A card like this can make for interesting games, and that's kind of all we're looking for when we draft or make a cube, isn't it? It's also probably not good in Constructed, but it does body the Moxen, and cripple some important game pieces in some decks. It's just a shame it costs 4 mana to do so. If you ever play an old school game or event and get mileage out of this, though, you are my hero, because that would be so fucking funny. The art on this card is also interesting. I don't know why this art hits my brain weird, but it does. It's got a lot going on. Oh hey, look at the little fox! Holy shit, I never noticed that little guy before. He's cute. But yeah, I don't hate the art, but I struggle to say that I like the art. Generally, I enjoy the weird and more stylistic pieces, but this just seems to be too overloaded in color for my tastes. Also, I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a representation of Titania herself, or just a bard that vibes with Titania. But she is pulling off a sick G chord, or at least that would be a G chord on standard guitar tuning. But this is a mandolin, so maybe it's a C7? I don't know. But I do appreciate that the hand is performing at least sort of a correct position. This piece was illustrated by Kirstine Kama, and it's an interesting piece. Not my favorite, but I do think it's well done at least. Okay, now we are to the artifacts, which is a big list of cards, so for the sake of timestamps and not wasting people's times, I'll break this down into artifact creatures and other artifacts. We'll start with the non-creature artifacts. First up is Amulet of Krug, a mono artifact that costs 2 mana to cast, and you can pay 2 and tap it to prevent 1 damage to any target. This is a nice to have kind of thing, but honestly, if you have the mana to use this, you're either in a commanding position or have nothing of actual value to do. It's not a bad effect, but making you pay 2 and tap this is kind of a lot for the little you get from it. That's not to say there won't be situations where this saves an important game piece, but this is a lot of investment for what it gives you. That being said, it is a C4, so it is a common artifact, and there is benefit to having artifacts in the artifact set, mainly as sacrifice fodder, and at only 2 mana, this isn't a terrible artifact to use as a sacrifice for other effects. 2 mana is the high end of what feels fine sacrificing, though. Anyway, here's some lore about these amulets. When Urza found himself the husband of the Princess of Krug, the Yoshin capital, he was quickly accepted by the common folk, despite being Argivian. Most of the citizens showed at least acceptance of the foreigner, but those of the Yoshin temples were more apprehensive. Argivians were atheistic by nature, and when Urza first came to Krug, he applied to be a scholar, but was turned down for his heritage. These feelings of distrust soon dissipated after he constructed these healing amulets that would calm and focus the wearer. He distributed the amulets to the temples, and the temples were flocked with further popularity and prosperity, as folks from far away would journey to Krug for healing. Next up is the continuous artifact Armageddon Clock. This one costs 6 mana, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a doom counter on Armageddon Clock. After that, this artifact deals damage equal to the number of doom counters on it to each player. It also has an activated ability that costs 4 mana and removes a doom counter from Armageddon Clock. This activated ability can be used by any player, but only during an upkeep step. This is an interesting artifact for a few reasons. First off, this artifact kinda shows the confusion between mono, poly, and continuous artifacts, because it blurs the lines a bit. It does have an ability that would make it continuous, but it also has an activated ability, like those found on poly artifacts. I have no idea if this designed to help push them away from the artifact types, but it does seem to be a canary in the coal mine. As for the card itself, it's pretty decent, in limited. It's 6 mana to take way too long to do anything in most forms of constructed, but in limited, it provides a decent level of pressure. It affects both players the same, which means it can just as easily bite you in the ass as it can help you, but if you play it smart, you'll either get a lot of pressure on your opponent, or tax them a lot of mana. Both of those are things that can help you win. It's far from a fantastic card, but it does help end games, one way or the other. Amy Weber illustrated Armageddon Clock, and it's a pretty sweet art. It's not anywhere near my favorite piece, but I do enjoy that it is so stylistically different than most of the art in Magic. One final interesting point about this card is that it is one of 4 cards to appear in the U2 rarity slot. So there are 2 copies of this card on the uncommon sheet. I just find it interesting that only 4 cards got this treatment. And this is a good segue, because our next card to talk about is also of U2 rarity. Ashnod's Altar is a very good card that still sees some level of play in some formats. For 3 mana, you get a sweet poly artifact that lets you sacrifice a creature and add 2 colorless mana. As this is a poly artifact, you can do this as many times as you want. That being said, this is a card that is much better in constructed than it is in a limited game. There's only 1 creature in this set that costs less than 2, but that creature is a common, so it is possible to do some cool stuff with this, even in limited. There is still some value to having sack outlets, and sacking a board presence for late game value might be all the value you need out of this card. But overall, it will usually be on the disappointing side, at least in limited, where most of the expensive artifacts kinda suck anyway, but that's to be expected from a combo piece in limited. Anson Maddox illustrated this, and the art is okay. I don't really have much to say about it. It's just a well-illustrated scene of a laboratory. I already mentioned that this card is a U2 rarity, but the next card we're talking about is also a U2 rarity, and it worked so well as a segue the first time, I figured we would segue into Ashnod's Battle Gear. Ashnod's Battle Gear is a mono artifact that costs 2. You can pay 2 and tap this to give target creature +2/-2 for as long as Ashnod's Battle Gear remains tapped, and you can choose to leave Ashnod's Battle Gear tapped during your upkeep. So this is an interesting card, if only for the fact that it's an early iteration of equipment, a design idea that wouldn't appear until later in the game's history. Mechanically, this works similarly to equipment, and it's not cheap, but it's also not too horribly priced for the time. The biggest problem you'll find with this is that there just aren't that many creatures you can equip this to. Yawgmoth Demon, Argothian Treefolk, and Martyrs of Corliss are the only non-artifact creatures that will survive equipping this without some sort of hoop. Overall, this is a solid card in Limited. It bolsters your attack options and only costs 2 mana. You can also sack it when it's more valuable to do so. I guess I don't know what else to say about it. It's equipment, which generally isn't great to begin with, but is usually fine in Limited. Like all the artifacts in this set, it's vulnerable to removal, but honestly, if you convince them to somehow use their removal on this, you probably came out ahead in that exchange. It's a solid card for what it is. It was illustrated by Mark Poole, and I have a question. Do you think Mark Poole was a fan of Iron Man comics? Just a thought I had, but I have trouble not just seeing Iron Man when I look at it. Up next is Ashnod's Transmogrant, which is an awesome card in the set because it's an artifact that only costs 1, so you can sack it to stuff without much mana investment. I'm only kind of kidding. Anyway, this card is a mono artifact that you can tap and sack to put a +1/+1 counter on target non-artifact creature. That creature is now an artifact in addition to its other types. So, this is a pretty bad card to actually use. Non-artifact creatures are preferable because none of the removal can hit them. So yeah, you give a creature +1/+1, but you also make it vulnerable to Crumble or Shatterstorm. There are times when that trade-off will be favorable for you, but you're much better off using this to feed your Yawgmoth Demon or whatever, in my opinion. It's sweet that it's such a cheap card, but it doesn't do much for it. That being said, you won't see too many of these around as it's a U3 rarity. Where this card does get interesting is the lore. So Ashnod was Mishra's apprentice, and at some point she approached Mishra, asking for funding and time off from pillaging Yoshin territory so she could focus on her own research. She promised to bring power to Mishra, and while he initially denied her request, she did get her way. So she asked for a bunch of materials, but most of what she required were humans that nobody would miss. So they funneled a lot of prisoners and criminals and such, and she eventually came up with these things, which are basically zombies or human robots. They had just enough cognition to follow orders, but that was about it. The funniest part of all of this is that she built up an army of them to show Mishra how impressive they were, and the first time they saw battle, they got their asses kicked by clay statues made by Taunos. It was one of a couple of major failures that she had that made Mishra eventually not trust her, which is pretty funny. The art on Ashnod's Transmogrant was done by Mark Keaton, and it's fantastic. I love this art. Checks like all the boxes of being the right amount of creepy, has that classic Magic vibe, and overall it's just really cool. Oh boy, buckle up for this one if you've never heard of Bronze Tablet. Bronze Tablet is a mono artifact that costs 6 mana and enters the battlefield tapped. You can spend 4 mana and tap Bronze Tablet to exile Bronze Tablet and a card in play owned by your opponent. You exchange ownership of the cards, unless your opponent pays 10 life to counter this effect. Oh, and you have to remove this card from your deck if you aren't playing for Anti. So this is a wild card. For one, it costs 10 mana and takes 2 turns to use, and from the context of the game that's being played, acts as a removal spell. Both Bronze Tablet and the card you traded it for are exiled from the game. So yeah, you traded them, but that doesn't affect the current game, other than exiling the permanent. This is a pretty bad card from that context. And also, it's pretty shitty as well. I don't know who thought a card like this was a good idea, but it's wild. It definitely has some novelty, and I am a fan of playing Anti in drafts or Cube as a game mechanic to let Anti cards be used, but I don't really like the idea of playing for keeps with cards. I can see the appeal, but for me it's always just distracted from the game itself. So I'd have this card available in a draft personally, but I can see cutting it. Although honestly it doesn't make much of a difference, as it's a U1 rarity, so it's not even likely to show up. I don't normally make a huge fuss about rulings on these cards, but the rulings for Bronze Tablet are really funny, so I'm going to read the rulings for a card that's been banned in all sanctioned play. If using a copy of the tablet, you must trade the copy card to your opponent just as you would have traded the tablet. That's funny as hell, but makes sense. You can't choose to pay 10 life if you have less than 10 life, but you may choose to give up the game immediately. This has roughly the same effect. Well, that answers that question. You can take control of your opponent's tablet, and in the trade, you only have to give them back their tablet. That's pretty brutal. Imagine using Aladdin to steal a bronze tablet. Of course, you'd have to give it haste, or they would have to be stupid to play the tablet into an Aladdin, but that's pretty funny. If the tablet is not still on the battlefield when the ability resolves, it is not exiled. The other player still has the choice to pay 10 life, and you still become the owner of their card if they choose not to do so. That's just disgusting. So you can activate your tablet, then respond to the trigger by bouncing your tablet, and your opponent is just fucked. That's fucking brutal. I suppose it probably works the same but opposite if your opponent bounces the thing you target. This card is probably good at starting fights. This card is brutal, but at least it's super expensive to use. The card isn't a good card by any stretch, but man, can it generate some bad feelings. The art also goes hard. Like, I've never really noticed how sweet the art is because it's so mundane, but the shading is actually nuts. I don't know, but I found myself just staring at the art for a bit. Bronze Tablet was illustrated by Tom Warnerstrand, but let's move on. Candelabra of Tanos is a sweet card. It's a mono artifact that costs 1 mana to cast, and you can tap and pay X to untap X number of lands. That's pretty sweet. It's really good at making ass tons of mana with the Tron lands, and I guess you could untap a Mishra's Factory to have a blocker up after you attacked with it, but that doesn't really feel cash money to me, especially since you'd have to dump another mana into it to turn it into a creature on your opponent's turn. That's really all you can do with this card from a limited perspective, and the whole Tron thing is kind of like chasing waterfalls, but you do you. Candelabra of Tanos is as rare as a card gets, only appearing on the uncommon sheet once, also known as U1. It was illustrated by Douglas Schuler, and I really like this piece. It's wondrous in its simplicity. Also, the shadow is a nice touch. Up next is Coral Helm, and this card sucks. It's a poly artifact that costs 3 mana. You can pay another 3 mana and discard a card at random to give a creature +2/+2 until end of turn. So, that's really bad. In most circumstances, this is just not worth it. Where this can be worth it is as a finisher. But even then, that's asking a lot. Like, you would have to let this sit on the field so your opponent would know that you can do it, or you would need to surprise drop this, discard your hand to hit them like a truck. But to do that, let's say you had 3 cards in hand after playing this. You'd need 3 to cast it, and another 9 mana to get +6/+6 to 1 creature. That's ditching your hand and 12 mana for +6/+6. If that's enough, that's enough, but to pull this off, you'd likely already be in a commanding position. It's only 3 mana though, so it wouldn't be the worst card in the set to sack to a Yawgmoth's Demon or something. It's a U1 rarity, so you aren't likely to see it, but man, I would feel so pissed if this was my rare. One of the worst cards in the set, no doubt. But again, it could maybe do something sometimes. But you'll be disappointed by this far more often than you'd be impressed by it. The art is kind of a miss for me too. Like, it's a full helm made out of coral floating in the bottom of the sea. But it doesn't look like it has a back. Obviously, there isn't much light in the sea, depending on how deep you go, but there's enough to make out the front of the helm. Should be able to see part of the back, or at the very least shade it darker to show that we can't see it. I don't know. I just don't like this art. Maybe how bad the card is spoils it for me. Hard to say. Coral Helm was illustrated by Amy Weber, and this is a rare miss, but still a miss for me. Cursed Rack is a continuous artifact that costs 4 mana to cast, and while it's in play, your opponent's maximum hand size is 4. So this is a bit of an interesting card. There isn't any card advantage in this set. The little card draw that exists is unreliable at best, and all of it either replaces a card or requires the sacking or destruction of a card to use, which kind of makes this card worthless in limited. Like, unless you find an opponent who's playing 1 card per turn, this isn't going to affect anyone. And if you do, that opponent was already probably going to lose because they had no board presence. It's also not great in Constructed, where it actually has the chance to work as intended. This card costs 4 mana to cast, and other than shutting down Library of Alexandria use, it doesn't really accomplish much. You're way better off using Black Vice, or the Rack if you're attacking their hand, than just spending 4 mana to change a game rule into one that's honestly not even that crippling. 4 cards is less than 7, that's for sure, but I still don't see this as a worthwhile use of your time or resources. I do have something interesting to say about the card, though, as it's the first card we've talked about that only appeared on the common sheet once, making it roughly as common as cards that appeared on the uncommon sheet 3 times. Little fun fact for you. Cursed Rack was illustrated by Richard Thomas, who also did Black Vice and The Rack, so all of these cards feature the same poor abused doll. The art's pretty solid, but I think this is my least favorite of the 3 of them. Next up is Feldon's Cane, which is a mono artifact that costs 1. You can tap and exile Feldon's Cane to shuffle your graveyard into your library. That's not a particularly useful effect, especially in Constructed, but in a limited environment, Feldon's Cane does have some useful attributes. First off, if you do this later in the game, and neither player can get over the other's defenses, it means your opponent will deck out instead of you. So that's useful. And its other perk is that it's a do-nothing artifact that only costs 1, so you can sacrifice it to whatever needs an artifact sacrificed for minimal mana investment. If used correctly, it can also throw off a millstone. But those are the only real uses for this artifact, but that's more use than you'd get out of it in Constructed, so that's pretty cool. Feldon's Cane appears on the common sheet, but like Cursed Rack, it only appears on the common sheet once. So this is an uncommon card, despite appearing in the common slots. Also, Feldon's Cane was originally called Feldon's Ice Cone, as an anagram for Don Felice Cone. Don Felice was one of the early playtesters and a member of the design and development teams in the early years of Wizards of the Coast. But yeah, there was a mix-up, and the artwork came back featuring a cane instead of whatever an ice cone is, so the name got changed to Feldon's Cane. Mark Teaton was the illustrator, and despite the mix-up, I do like this art, but it kinda looks like a sprayer head for some industrial equipment. In the lore, Feldon was one of the founding members of the Union of the Third Path, and was the scholar who first got his hands on the Golgathian Silex. He spent much of his time around the Colchican Mountains, and was one of the few people to escape most of the bloodshed, leaving Teresia City by way of secret tunnels after Mishra took the city. He also survived the activation of the Golgothian Silex. And speaking of, the next card we're going to talk about is the Golgothian Silex. This is a mono artifact that costs 4 to play, and you can pay 1 to tap Golgothian Silex, cause every card originally printed in this set to be sacrificed. We've seen a card like this before, but this set hoser is a lot more chill than City in a Bottle. For one, it's not a stacks piece that prevents any Antiquities cards from ever being played again, and 2, it costs more, and 3, it requires activating it. My feelings on set hosers in drafts and cube hasn't changed. I still think they spice things up, and this one even has the decency to let the game actually go on after it's used, making it less oppressive than the first attempt. I also think this one is next to useless and Constructed, since there aren't too many cards from this set that see significant play in a wide assortment of decks. In Limited, this is a powerhouse, though. As I said, it doesn't shut down the rest of the game, but it does wipe every card played, so obviously you would sandbag a bit and let your opponent commit hard to the board to get advantage that way. I wouldn't recommend running this card if you were running Tron lands, but I still would recommend drafting it so it doesn't get used on you. You won't see Golgothian Silex often, though. It is a U1, so as rare as a card can be in this set. The lore around the Golgothian Silex is pretty important to the story. It was fished out of the water by a fisherman and given to Feldon to study. He gave the Silex to Lauren during the sacking of Teresia City, and she got jumped by Ashnod, who used a rock slide to fuck up Lauren's traveling party and got her arm crushed. Ashnod nursed her back to health to torture her for information, but Lauren did eventually escape and meet up with Feldon. Ashnod, however, kept the Silex and met up with Mishra in Argoth. Ashnod had previously been banished from Mishra's lands after she had got caught helping Tawnos escape capture. Mishra was less than happy to see her, but tolerated her presence all the same. Ashnod realized that Mishra was fully within the influence of the Brotherhood of Gix, and when they demanded the Silex, she acquiesced and gave them a fake. She didn't really trust Mishra anymore, so she had made a convincing replica of the Silex and imbued it with magic, which is something else she learned how to do from Lauren. Anyway, she saw the writing on the wall and she made her way to Tawnos. She gave Tawnos the Silex and told him to take it to Urza and vaguely explained how to use it. Pour the memories of the land into the Silex. While they were talking, Gix attacked them, and Ashnod held him off as Tawnos took the Silex to Urza, who used it and destroyed practically everything and started an ice age. Neat stuff. Anyway, Golgothian Silex is the last card that we'll talk about that was illustrated by Kristen Kamen, as they only illustrated 3 cards for Magic the Gathering. Next up is Ivory Tower, and this card is really good and really annoying to play against, especially for aggro. Ivory Tower costs 1 mana, and while this is in play, at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 1 life for each card in your hand above 4. So, if you have 7 cards in hand, you'll gain 3 life. This is a card that is much better in Constructed because there's actually card advantage in the card pool, but it's not entirely useless in Limited. If you played a slow game and sandbagged for a few turns, this would bring you some value, but you'd have to have some cards that supported that playstyle. It would go together nicely with Golgothian Silex, if you got lucky enough for Ivory Tower to be in your opening hand, that is. Just play it and drop lands for the first few turns, then on turn 5 or 6, drop the Silex and blow your opponent out of the water. But that relies on a lot of Christmas magic to work out for you, especially since Ivory Tower is a U3 rare, which is probably for the best, but it does make it harder to build a deck strategy around. Fantastic card in Constructed, though. Goes super great in a slow control deck. The Ivory Tower this card represents is one of many in Teresia City, a city of ivory and marble that was dedicated to scholarly pursuits and peace. Drafna, Herkel, and Feldon all spent time here while they tried to figure out how to stop Urza and Mishra. Ivory Tower was illustrated by Margaret Organ Keene, which, as I've mentioned, was unfortunately misprinted. This art is fantastic, though. I love this art. The simplicity of the sun and the sky juxtaposed against the fine details of the tower just hits so hard. It's a fantastic piece. Jaloom Tome is a mono artifact that costs 3 to cast, and you can pay 2 and tap Jaloom Tome to draw and then discard a card. So, this is not great. It's not the worst card that says draw a card on it, but this isn't card advantage, so unless you're digging for something specific and don't care about ditching other things to get there, then you're going to be disappointed with this. Generally, if that was your plan, you'd have some sort of combo or some win condition that depended on specific cards. There is some upside, of course. You can dig for removal you need or your rarer cards, but 2 mana to trade a card is sort of a heavy cost. It's less heavy and limited than Constructed, so again, this isn't bad. It's just not great. It's not a likely card to show up, though, as it's the last of the cards we're going to talk about today that are a U2 rarity. But let's talk about the lore. Jaloom Tome is a really hilarious part of the story. When Urza first set out on his own after the falling out with his brother led to the death of Takashia, he ended up in the Yoshin territory in the capital Krug, under the employ of a clockmaker named Rusko. Rusko liked and appreciated Urza, but found him boorish and too engrossed in his work. To liven the young man up a bit, Rusko dragged Urza to an event being held by the ruler of Krug. This warlord had grown impatient in times of peace and found most suitors for his daughter to be weak in will and body. So he had a large jade statue erected and offered the hand of his daughter to anyone who could move the statue across the room. Urza himself was uninterested in the beautiful daughter, and equally so of the brutes that kept injuring themselves to win her hand. But while they were there, the dowry caught his eye, and among the priceless treasures was the Jaloom Tome, which was written in Thrawn. So Urza built a machine to move the jade statue, and while it's a long story, it eventually worked out, and he married the princess of the realm so he could read a book. What a fucking nerd. But also a Chad. Jalum Tome was illustrated by Tom Wannerstrand, and I really like the art. I specifically like the shading and the light casting shadows. I think it's good. Our next artifact is the Might Stone. It costs 4 mana to cast, and attacking creatures get +1/+1, which is a pretty anticlimactic effect for how massive this stone is in the lore. It's not good in constructed, and it's probably fine in limited. Giving all your creatures a boost is nice, but it's 4 mana and it's not that much of a boost. And it's symmetrical. Yeah, I don't even know what to say about this card mechanically. Like, there aren't any gems of hard to see truth in this thing, right? No amount of experience is going to unlock some unforeseen way to play with this. When I say play this when your guys can kick your opponent's ass and you can sack it when you need to because it's an artifact, nobody is going to learn anything from me saying that. I guess I can say that it's only attacking creatures if you miss that bit, but yeah, kind of a shame. The lore hypes this thing up so much, but it kind of sucks. It's also a U3, so it's fairly common, which is kind of funny. But I guess let's talk about the lore a bit. The Might Stone is one half of a power stone that Toshka, Urza, and Mishra found while exploring the Cave of Kolios. Mishra and Urza had an argument about touching the stone, and it blew up in their faces, and Urza got the might half of the stone. This event marked the beginning of the brothers' distrust and eventual resentment towards each other, and both brothers desired the other half of the stone to study it or use its power. The stones had an intoxicating effect on the brothers that pulled them apart and made them both obsessive. These two stones were pretty much the entire reason for the Brothers' War. Well, at least Mishra and Urza's parts in the war, which were big. Mightstone was illustrated by Pete Venters, and while I don't really like the literal interpretation Pete had when creating this art, it is well done and manages to look cool as hell. Oh boy, it's Millstone. This thing is sick. Millstone costs 2 mana to cast, and you can pay 2 and tap Millstone to send 2 of your opponent's cards from the top of their library to their graveyard. Or mill them to, as we'd say it today. Can you guess where the keyword mill got its name? So, yeah, this thing is pretty sweet. This is the first card with this kind of effect, and made players think about alternative ways to win the game. I'm not sure that there are many constructed decks that rely on this as a win con, but man, they have to be brutal to play against. Slam this in a control deck and just deny everything all game while slowly milling your opponent out. Brutal. In limited, this can also do work, and it can do it easier with 40 card decks running around. With the cards in this card pool, you could probably clog up the game enough for Millstone to do its job, but you would have to worry about removal. There's a decent amount of artifact removal in this set, and there aren't any counterspells, so if someone decides to crumble your millstone, you better buckle up for the long game, because you're going to have to mill them out one turn at a time, the old-fashioned way. Also, you better hope they don't have a Feldon's Cane. But, since Millstone is a U3, the odds are just as likely that they'll have a Feldon's Cane as they are that you'll have a Millstone. I don't have any lore about an agricultural tool, but the flavor of this card is pretty awesome. The grinding of a millstone is annoying as shit. I've never tried to read a book near one, but I would imagine it would drive me insane too. Millstone was illustrated by Kaja Folio, and the art is banger. I love the galactic background, and the stone itself isn't too shabby either. Obelisk of Undoing is a mono artifact that costs 1 mana to cast, and you can pay 6 and tap Obelisk of Undoing to return target permanent you both own and control to your hand. It's also a rare, or the equivalent of a rare in this set, being a U1. This card is interesting. It's a good way to protect a very important piece of your game plan, like a millstone, for example, but to use it effectively, you need to hold 6 mana up, which is not ideal. There aren't any enter the battlefield effects in this set, so you can't loop a useful effect, and other than that, or protecting something that's targeting, I don't really see what you would use this for. I guess you could combine it with a bronze tablet to systematically take your opponent's entire deck, But that would require so much mana, I don't even know how you'd get to that point in a game. I guess you could do it as early as turn 4 if you got out the Tron lands and a Candelabra of Tawnos. Maybe that is possible. But damn, that's dirty. And the odds of that happening are like nil. You would require a lot of rare cards to be drafted into one deck and also drawn early. That aside, this card is interesting, but I don't think I'd call it practical. It does only cost 1 mana to cast, so you could just use it as sack fodder, which isn't a bad use of a card in this limited environment. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about this card. But the flavor text mentions the Battle of Tomakul, so I suppose I could discuss that. Tomakul was the capital of the Fallujah Empire, which was ruled by Mishra. At this point in time, Mishra was sieging Teresia City, and while his forces were distracted, Urza marched on his capital. Unfortunately for Urza, he lost this battle pretty hard for a couple of reasons. He had set up defensive towers along his path to enable defense of his supply line, but Fallujah cavalry disrupted his defenses, and Mishra broke Teresia City with the help of the Brotherhood of Gix, just opening the doors. Urza obviously didn't know Teresia City had traitors, so the siege ended quicker than expected, which freed up Fallujah soldiers to attack Urza, and his planned siege of Tomakul never happened. Tawnos got captured during that battle. Anyway, Obelisk of Undoing was illustrated by Tom Warnerstrand, and it's a pretty piece. The sunset is nice. Up next is Rockalite, and this is a pretty card. Rockalite is a poly artifact that costs 6 mana to cast, and you can pay 2 to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn. Then, Rockalite is returned to your hand at the end of turn. It's a good counter to Rocket Launcher if you both have the mana to tango, but it seems like a heavy mana investment for the effect. Yeah, I'm struggling to see the vision on this one, if I'm being honest. It's fine to just set and forget until a big enough amount of damage comes through, and you have the mana to prevent most of it. It might not be clear, but you can use this effect as much as you can pay for. It just goes back to your hand at the end of the turn. You activate the ability. I don't know, dudes. I think this is pretty trash, but it has its uses, I guess. And depending on what lands you're running, it'll be fairly easy to get this out. Rackalite is a U3 rarity, so it's not too common, and it's overall just fine. It's certainly not great, but it's passable. The late great Christopher Rush illustrated Rackalite, and the art is pretty sick. It's no lightning bolt, but it's still pretty solid. The art, that is. The card is not so solid. But do you know what is pretty solid? Rocket Launcher. Costs 4 mana to cast, and you cannot activate the ability of Rocket Launcher until it begins a turn in play under your control. So you basically have to give your opponent a heads up that you're going to blast their ass to Kingdom Come. Which I think is fair and respectable balancing. Oh yeah, forgot to explain what this card does. You can pay 2 mana to deal 1 damage to any target, and Rocket Launcher is destroyed at the end of the turn it's used. Just like Rackalite, you can activate this ability as much as you can pay for. So this works well as a win con in infinite mana decks. Not as well as a Fireball or Brain Geyser, but well enough to get the job done. You aren't going to be doing that in Limited, but this card is still very valuable. Assuming they don't have a way to blow it up or deal with all the damage you put out, this is fantastic at opening the board up to let your creatures get in to finish the game. Or if you only need to hit your opponent for like 5-6 damage, this can be a decent finisher. And there are ways in this set to get big mana. If you have 2 sets of Tron lands and a Candelabra of Tawnos, you can make like 22 mana, which is 11 damage. Not enough to one-shot, but it's gonna hurt like hell. And if you have a power artifact, that is enough to kill. This is a fun card. I really like this card. Just like Rackalite, it's also a U3 rarity, so you might get your hands on one, but probably not more than one. 2 rocket launchers, a bunch of Urza lands, and a Candelabra would be a fun as hell deck, though. Folds to crumble, but what doesn't in this set? Rocket Launcher was illustrated by Pete Venters, and he did great. I love the art. Really helps with how cool this card is. Next up is the Staff of Zegan. This mono artifact costs 4 mana to cast, and you can pay 3 and tap Staff of Zegan to give target creature -2/-0 until end of turn. Yeah, this isn't an impressive card. That's not to say it won't ever do anything of value, but that effect isn't worth the cost in my opinion. It can't even remove a creature, which would completely change my opinion on this card. It also costs 4, which is a little pricey for sacrifice fodder. Staff of Zegon is a C4 though, so you will see this thing around. There is some fun lore about this card though. So, the Staff of Zegan describes a series of staffs that were made by Ashnod. Shortly after Mishra got his first Dragon Engine and promotion to Wizard and Advisor to the Qadir ordered they capture Zegan. When they showed up to take Zegan, the Dragon Engine halted about a half-mile from the city and would go no further. The reason for this was explained to Mishra that night as Ashnod showed up in his tent to negotiate the surrender of Zegan. The staff was also capable of weakening men to the point of collapse, but the staffs did tire out their users. Mishra accepted the terms of surrender, which included Ashnod becoming Mishra's apprentice. Anyway, Staff of Zegan was illustrated by Mark Poole, and I really like the art. I think he did a great job with this one. Just a no-nonsense painting of a dude wielding a staff. Simple and sweet. Now we are on Tablet of Epitir, or however you pronounce that. A poly artifact that costs 1, and while it's in play, you can spend 1 mana anytime one of your artifacts goes to the graveyard to gain 1 life. But probably the coolest part of this artifact is that it's a C4, which means it's a 1-cost artifact that's actually common. This is pretty garbage and constructed, but that's obvious. However, this is actually pretty useful in a limited environment. It only costs 1 mana, so if you want to try drawing cards with Goblin Artisans, or thin your deck with Sage of Latnam, or keep your Yawgmoth Demon well fed, this is an excellent card to sack to those cards, or anything else you need to sack an artifact to. You can gain life off of sacking other artifacts too, so you could get some value out of this before it hits the chopping block. But yeah, that's really all there is to this card. Good sack fodder. The art is really sweet though. Christopher Rush illustrated this piece and it's quite detailed. Next up is Tawnos' Coffin, a mono artifact that costs 4 mana to cast. You can pay 3 mana and tap Tawnos' Coffin to exile a creature with all auras and counters still attached to it. This creature remains out of play until Tawnos' Coffin is untapped, or leaves the battlefield. And naturally, you can choose not to untap it during your upkeep. So, this is pretty bad. It does let you protect an important game piece as long as that piece is a creature, so it's not useless, but it's a pretty heavy mana investment, and honestly, without creature removal, the only things that can deal with a non-artifact creature are pingers. But since you can't remove those creatures either, this is just going to delay the inevitable. I'd say it would be useful in certain situations in Constructed, but the card pool expands to cards so good you'd never really consider this in most situations. Luckily, it's a U1 rarity, so you're likely to not even see it. The lore is pretty cool though. Tawnos originally built this coffin to contain Mishra, because Tawnos thought that Urza wouldn't be willing or able to kill his brother, but certainly couldn't let him go free. Tawnos hid in the coffin when Urza activated the Silex and blew the world to hell, thus surviving the blast. And the art is fine. I don't really feel any way about it, but Tawnos' coffin was illustrated by Christopher Rush. Then we have Tawnos' Wand, which is a mono artifact that costs 4 mana and you can pay 2 mana and tap this card to make a creature with power 2 or less unblockable until the end of turn. Also, this card says artifact creatures can still block this, but the errata remove that, so depending on how you're playing, that's an important difference to note. It's almost playable without the artifact exception, but either way, this is a bit pricey with as much artifact removal going around in this set, but the effect is at least useful. There are a few ways to pump things after you activate this, which is handy, but if you're playing as written, it's still pretty useless. There are quite a few artifact creatures in this set, and some of them are even common, so your opponent is likely to have artifact creatures. I really can't recommend using this card unless you have nothing better to play, which I guess is certainly possible. Douglas Schuler illustrated this piece, and it's pretty good. It's simple, but that's not a criticism. And oh yeah, Tawnos' wand is a U3 rarity, so yeah, uncommon. Keeping with Tawnos' stuff, next we have Tawnos' weaponry, a mono artifact that costs 2, and you can pay 2 and tap Tawnos' weaponry to give target creature +1/+1 until Tawnos' weaponry is untapped. And you can choose not to untap it. This is another early attempt at equipment, and this card is fine. It does equip at instant speed, which is cool, and it's only 2 mana, so it is a relatively juicy sacrifice target if all else fails. In fact, this is one of those ways to pump a creature you made unblockable with Tawnos' wand. So that's some synergy for you. Like the wand, Tawnos' weaponry is of U3 rarity. Tawnos' weaponry was illustrated by Dan Frazier, and it's fine. The art is well done, but his haircut makes him look like a dork. The Rack is a continuous artifact that costs 1 mana to cast. While it's not in play, at the beginning of your opponent's upkeep, they take X damage, where X is 3 minus the number of cards in their hand. So if they have no cards in hand, they take 3 damage. It's a U3 rarity, and while there isn't much for hand disruption in this set, there also isn't card advantage, so they either have to sandbag or they'll get low eventually. This is a pretty good card. It's better in constructed, but it's solid enough in limited as well. Especially since it only costs 1. So if they somehow manage to avoid it, you can always sack it to something that needs artifacts. But I'd be hesitant to sack this card for sure. It's just really good and efficient. Like Black Vice and Cursed Rack, this was illustrated by Richard Thomas and uses the same stuffed doll as those other cards in its art. This one is pretty cool. I like this art. Next up is Urza's Chalice, and this is a poly artifact that costs 1 mana, and whenever a player casts an artifact, you may pay 1 mana to gain 1 life. So this is a continuation of the Lucky Charm cycle from Alpha, and it's a pretty cool card. It's especially useful in this limited environment for a few reasons. First off, it's a C4 rarity, so you can get your hands on a few of them. It's also only 1 mana, so it's juicy to sack, and it's not a huge mana investment. So if you have extra mana lying around, you can squeeze out some extra value instead of leaving that mana on the table. Just a decent card that has uses outside of its arguably mediocre effect. It was illustrated by Jeff A. Menges, and the art is well done, if not a little dull. From a lore perspective, Urza's Chalice was made from a retrofitted pump used by the Omlets, which were filled with a mystical liquid with healing properties. None of that really makes any sense to me, but hey, it's flavorful. Urza's Mitre is spelled wrong, or at least it's not the most common spelling. It's usually spelled Mitre, but that's not important. What is important is that it's a poly artifact that costs 3 mana to cast, and whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield and wasn't sacrificed, you can pay 3 mana to draw a card. So this has potential, and you might get use out of this, but it is a lot of mana, and you kind of need your opponent to cooperate with you to get any value out of this. Yeah, this artifact is in a rough spot. It's a little too expensive to sack, it's a little hard to squeeze card draw out of it, but this does replace your threats with another card if they get removed and you have 3 mana sitting around. It's a lot of hoops to jump through, and I don't like it. This card doesn't bring me joy. Well, the art does. I think the art is fantastic. Urza's Mitre was illustrated by Randy Asplin Faith, but the P and the S were swapped on the card, so it's misprinted. Old Magic cards and misspelled artist names. Name a more iconic duo. Oh yeah, it's a rare card as well, being a U1. Anyway, on to the lore. This mitre was presented to Urza when he was crowned Lord High Artificer and Protector of the Realms by the Argivian people, because they were terrified of Mishra stealing all their shit and massacring them. When Tanos asked him why he would accept such a ridiculous title, Urza showed him the mitre, and all the gemstones attached to it were power stones. And like, a lot of power stones. More than Urza had ever had in one place. So he took a job of major responsibility and power for an industrial-sized pack of batteries. Urza is so incorrigible. And we've made it to the last of the non-artifact creature cards. And it's looking a little familiar. We have Weakstone, a continuous artifact that costs 4 mana, and while it's in play, attacking creatures get -1/-0. That seems familiar. Oh yeah, the Mightstone. It's just the opposite of the Mightstone. Have both of these in play, and they cancel out. Like the Mightstone, this affects both players, but while you can play the Mightstone when the benefit will allow you to win the game, it's hard to make the same determination with the Weakstone. I suppose if your plan is to like torpedo your opponent with a rocket launcher or win through other non-combat means, this is a solid hate piece that keeps your opponents from running you over. It might also be worth drafting if you're running Millstone, I suppose. But if your plan involves turning creatures sideways, I'd stay away from this card. Like the Mightstone, this is a U3 rarity, which again doesn't make much sense with how crucial these stones are to the entire story of the set, but to be fair, I don't know how much of the lore was written when they made the cards. The art for Weakstone was illustrated by Justin Harper, and I think this is his best work in this set. As for the lore, I covered most of that in the Mightstone section, and what parts I didn't got covered by other cards. I guess I could mention after Urza activated the Silex and blew the world to hell, his spark activated, and the Might and Weak stones were absorbed into Urza and replaced his eyes. So that's pretty neat. But with that, we've reached the artifact creatures. So let's get started with these automatons, shall we? First up on our list of creatures is Battering Ram. It's a 1/1 that costs 2 mana to cast, and it gains banding while it's attacking, and if it's blocked by a wall, that wall is destroyed at the end of combat. This would be pretty cool if there was more than one wall in the set, but hey, at least there's a wall in this set. It's more than poor Alibaba can claim in its limited environment. Having banding is also pretty cool, especially since this card is a C4, so it's not unreasonable to assume you could have multiples of this card. But this is one of the only cards with banding in this set, and its real value comes from being a 2-dropped artifact that you can sack for value. It's not bad by the standards of limited, but it's also not great. I don't know. I don't have much to say about this card. It was illustrated by Jeff A. Menges, and the art is solid, but nothing out of this world. Play Statues next on our list, and this thing is actually pretty sweet. It's a 3/1 that costs 4 mana and can be regenerated for 2 mana. It's also a C4, so plenty of these guys to go around. 4 mana is a little pricey for what you're getting, but the regeneration is nice. As long as you keep mana up, you can keep this around, and 3 power is actually pretty powerful for this set, at least against most of the set. There are a couple creatures this can't threaten, but it can threaten the vast majority of the creatures you'll see, as the low-to-the-ground creatures tend to be more common. It's just a good aggro creature as long as you hold back a bit of mana to regenerate it. The lore behind the clay statues is pretty cool as well. After the fall of Krug, Tawnos and Caleb Ben Krug were separated from Urza, and it took Tawnos like 3 years to meet back up. During that time, he discovered a type of clay that would stay moist and self-mend itself. If you cut it, it would slowly fuse back together. So he built creatures out of a metal frame with wicker and covered them in this clay that made them difficult to deal with. Eventually, a weakness would be found when Ashnod figured out to teach her transmogrants to grab at the clay and throw it to the ground, preventing the clay statues from healing from their wounds. Also, the flavor text is true as well. When Tawnos and Urza met back up, Urza promoted Tawnos to a Master Artificer. The art is really cool on this piece too. It was done by Jesper Meerfers, the art director at the time. Clockwork Avian is a super cool card. For 5 mana, you get a 0/4 flying artifact creature that enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+0 counters on it. Whenever Clockwork Avian attacks or blocks, you remove a +1/+0 counter from it, and during your upkeep you can pay 1 mana per counter to add +1/+0 counters onto this creature. But the number can't be higher than 4. So this is another iteration of Clockwork Beast, and it's a very cool design. It's a pretty solid rate for the time too, being a 4/4 flyer for 5 mana. Obviously, this thing requires some maintenance, but it's also really handy and limited because there are only 5 flying creatures in this set. Clockwork Avian is a U1 rarity, so it won't come up much, but it's very cool and flavorful, and a fun card. Hardly the best flyer in the set, but it's up there, and it's arguably the best colorless flyer in the set. The art is fantastic too. I really like this piece. It was illustrated by Randy Asplund Faith. Oh boy, up next is the big boy. Colossus of Sardia is a 9/9 that costs 9 mana and has trample. This thing hits hard, but Colossus of Sardia doesn't untap during your untap step unless you pay 9 to tap it. That's pretty rough, and this card is not good in Constructed. It also hurts like hell to pay 9 mana for this just for some jackass to spend a green mana destroying it. On the plus side, it does get around Dampening Field because you have to pay 9 mana to untap it. This is also a rare card with a rarity of U1, which makes sense since it's massive. It's the biggest creature printed in Magic at the time of this set's release, and man is this Timmy bait. The trample is nice, but realistically you're only likely to get one swing in with this thing, but one swing is probably enough. Like, assuming a normal game where you pressure your opponent and get in early swings and flush out their removal, this is a decent way to close out a game. Assuming you flush their removal, and don't expect it to work in game 2, they'll hold back something for this as long as they can. Colossus of Sardia is really flavorful, if you know the lore. Right before the final battle between Urza and Mishra, after Argoth was pillaged for resources, Gaia sent her Avenger to deal with Urza's forces. Urza had a Colossus that was built with Sardian resources, and the two had a fight where they both threw like one punch and then immediately died and broke down. That's pretty similar to the idea of paying 9 mana to use this just once to have to pay 9 mana again to use it. So I find that charming. Still a bad card though, but at least it has trample. The art for Colossus of Sardia was illustrated by Jesper Miervers, and it's pretty sweet. Anyway, here's Dragon Engine, a 3 mana 1/3 that has an activated ability and gives it +1/+0 until end of turn for every 2 mana dumped into it. Dragon Engine is a common card as well, showing up on the common sheet 4 times. And this card is pretty okay. It doesn't have trample or any evasion, which is rough. But if you have nothing better to spend your mana on, this is decent. It survives against a lot of the more common creatures, and assuming you can clear the way, this has potential to deal decent damage to your opponent. The rate is pretty rough though. 2 mana for 1 damage isn't great, but it is comparable to everything in this set. So from a limited perspective, that's not a huge deal. Like all artifacts, it does suffer from being easy to remove, but this wouldn't be the worst creature to invest in. Don't get me twisted, this isn't a good card, but it is serviceable and limited. There isn't really any good creatures in these early few sets anyway. Dragon Engine was illustrated by Anson Maddox, and the art is cool. I like the Steam Engine vibe this card has. As for the lore, the Dragon Engines were monstrous machines, the first of which dug itself out of the desert and killed the Kadir that allowed Mishra to tutor his son, thus giving Mishra the opportunity to get out of slavery and into a position of influence and eventually power. The first Dragon Engine responded to Mishra and his stone, and Mishra found he could control the device. Eventually, Mishra and Ashnod found themselves in Phyrexia after entering a portal in the Cave of Kolios, and Mishra was able to gather more of these impressive war machines. As the flavor text says, they were instrumental to the sacking of Krug. Grape Shot Catapult is actually a pretty solid card. Sort of. It costs 4 mana to cast, which is a little rough, and it's a 2/3, which is nice, that can be tapped to deal 1 damage to a creature with flying. Pinging a creature with damage is pretty useful, and flying creatures are problematic to deal with, but this does have some issues. For one, there is only one non-artifact creature in this set, and it's a 6/6. That's not to say you can't hit flying artifact creatures, but those are susceptible to artifact removal, so this is inherently less valuable against them. But on the other hand, killing an artifact creature with this does spare your artifact removal for other threats. You'd need at least 2 of these for even the smallest flyer though, as they all have at least 2 toughness, other than one we'll talk about in a bit, but that's circumstantial. Grape Shot Catapult is a C4 rarity, so it's not out of the question to have multiple of these, but again, they cost 4 mana to cast, so it is a heavy investment. The point I'm trying to make is that pingers are good, but part of what makes them good is their versatility, and this is pretty restrictive in what it can do. It's certainly useful if the situation calls for it, but otherwise it kind of feels bad. From a lore perspective, these are kind of interesting in the world building they provide. During the early years of the brothers' lives, they studied under Tokeshia in the Great Desert digging up artifacts, and one of the major threats in the desert were giant ruck birds that would occasionally attack. Using grapeshot to fling at the birds had significantly higher odds of hitting than a single stone would have, not dissimilar to how buckshot is used for bird hunting. So these devices were used to defend their camp. It's pretty interesting stuff. The art was illustrated by Dan Fraser, and it's a pretty solid piece. It seems more involved than a lot of his work, but it does lack that iconic vibe. Mishra's War Machine is a really bad card for a few different reasons. It costs 7 mana to cast, and it's a 5/5. It has banding, and during your upkeep, you have to discard a card, or Mishra's War Machine hits you in the face with a lightning bolt. 3 damage is a lot, especially when to prevent it, you have to discard a card in a set with no card advantage. There's no way to replace that card in this limited environment. But even if there was, this card would still suck. Also, it's banding on a 5/5. Like, why doesn't it also have trample? Why can't it hit flyers? Why can't you tap it to deal 3 damage to any target? It can deal 3 damage to you. Like, this is just genuinely awful. It's so awful, I forgot it had banding when I told you that Battering Ram was, like, the only creature with banding. This is the worst card in the set, but luckily it's a rare, so you won't have to deal with it much. But yeah, don't play this. Once you run out of cards, you'll either never draw again, or you'll take 3 damage and won't even get to use it. Also, banding on a 5/5 is definitely a choice. Like, sure, it's flavorful, but this card really sucks. Just don't play this card. Lore-wise, it's kind of interesting, though. Mishra's War Machine is a Thrawn cart that Mishra discovered while serving as the Kadir's Raka, or wizard, and he had it refurbished and fitted with ballistas and other devices of war. It was then hitched to the back of a dragon engine as a show of force. Its first appearance came during the second peace talks that took place in Krug. Mishra's War Machine was illustrated by Amy Weber, and the art is fine, I guess. I really like the night sky with the constellations, but I think how bad this card is just kind of sours the art for me. Not really a fan of the art overall. Up next is Unlet, which is pretty sweet. It's a 2/2 creature that costs 3, and when it dies, you gain 2 life. So this thing is just begging to be sacrificed for value, but 3 mana is a lot for value sacking. On the plus side, you get life when it goes. Unlet is a U3 rarity, so you'll see it a bit, but not often. It's also interesting to note that Unlet was originally called Unlets, because it's an anagram and reference to Soulnet. But the art came back with only one creature in the art, so they cut the S. Anyway, Anson Maddox illustrated this, and it's pretty sweet, but it does look like a picnic table. The lore around this card is pretty cool too. The Unlet are interesting as they are the first working automatons we are exposed to in the book The Brothers' War. Tokesha had managed to get a fair number of these automatons in working order by the time the brothers first showed up to work for her, and they immediately impressed her by realizing that they were not living creatures. The Unlets lacked a natural gait, which tipped off the perceptive and intelligent brothers. The little watering or food dish in the art is also especially funny, as the students of Tokesha's desert camp would prank new arrivals by giving them the task of feeding the Unlets, and requiring the new students to make sure the Unlet finished its meal. As machines, they required no meals. Once they broke down, the hydraulic fluids and oils inside them could be used to make a type of healing tea that the camp would trade to the local Falaja. Alright, we get to talk about a genuinely playable card next. Ornithopter is a 0/2 artifact flying creature that costs 0 mana to cast. This thing is awesome. It's such a cool card, but you don't need me to tell you that. Everyone loves Ornithopter. It's an artifact that costs 0 mana to play, and it's a C4, so this little guy is all around us. It is a little less valuable in limited than it is in constructed, because there really aren't many ways to make it more than the sum of its parts. It is good to sacrifice, though. And there are some ways to pump it up. Hell, you could slap a Tawnos' weaponry and an Ashnod's bodyguard on this bad boy and make it a 3/1 flyer, which is pretty funny, but I'm not convinced that's the best thing to be doing with this card. Also, while I was writing the script and going through all the cards and reading stories and researching, I made my way to the fandom wiki page to give me some directions to take my research. They have a trivia page that I checked out, and most of it was stuff that I had already found in other sources, or even just stuff that was obvious. Like the trivia point saying Sage of Latnam is the only blue creature in the set. Like, yeah, that's true. And maybe I'm just too in the weeds to understand what is fun trivia, but the trivia point on Ornithopter just kinda hit me weird. It says, Ornithopter is the first creature to cost 0, demonstrating that the cost of a card from your hand is worth something by itself. That is a true fact, but also there were 0 cost artifacts in Alpha. Doesn't Mox Jet or Black Lotus demonstrate the same thing? And sure, those cards are straight busted and obviously undercosted, and Ornithopter is pretty fairly costed, but still, it just hit me as a weird line. But yes, the limited resource of cards in your hand is of some value, regardless of the mana cost. But I'm complaining about nothing. Ornithopter's a great card. You can do cool stuff with it in Constructed, and you can make some use of it in this limited environment as well. Ornithopter is also very relevant to the story of the Brothers' War. Contrary to what the flavor text says, the Ornithopters were not designed by Urza. They were a Thrawn artifact that was discovered shortly after the brothers arrived at Tokesha's camp. However, the Ornithopter they found was so damaged, its use was all but impossible to decipher, until Urza figured out that they were a flying machine. Urza, Mishra, and Tokesha spent months figuring out how to rebuild one, and the first ever ornithopter to be functional in the era of the brothers was also one of the first major fights the brothers ever had. They argued over who should be the first to fly the ornithopter, and only by Tokesha suggesting that she should risk her life were the brothers able to flip a coin to determine who got the first honor. Urza got to fly the machine first, gaining the honor of being the first to fly, but Mishra went second, and while in the air, discovered geoglyphs that housed more artifacts, and eventually led them to the Cave of Kolios. Ornithopter was illustrated by Amy Weber, and this piece is just awesome. I love it. 10 out of 10. No notes. Primal Clay is by no means an iconic card, but it is certainly another interesting card. It's a 4-mana creature that is either a 3/3 creature, or a 2/2 flying creature, or a 1/6 wall. Damn, I said there was only one wall, and I wasn't thinking of this. These are a lot of cards to remember, and most of them suck for anything other than limited. Sorry I keep lying to you guys. I just forgot. So, there are 2 walls, and 2 or 3 banding creatures in this set. Anyway, Primal Clay is modular. It changes based on your need, and its rate isn't amazing, but it's also not super terrible for the time. When you cast Primal Clay, you pick which form it'll take, and it doesn't change unless you bounce it or something. It's also a U3 rarity, so you won't see it too often. This card is fine. It's really nice that you can make it what you need for the current situation, but 4 mana for a creature is rough. But it could be worse. Yeah, this is fine. This is probably one of the most mid cards in this set. Doesn't do anything fantastic, but it's also not offensively bad, so yeah. Draft it if there isn't anything better in the pack, but otherwise don't. Just like every other card. But as long as you don't put the weight of the world on this card's shoulders, it probably won't disappoint you. Probably. Primal Clay was illustrated by Akaja Folio, and I like this art. Also, I do kind of suspect that this is a bit of a self-portrait of her and Phil, which I think is cute. Up next is Shapeshifter, which is a creature that costs 6 mana. When you cast this, and during each of your upkeeps, you choose a number between 0 and 6, and its power is that number, while its toughness is 7 minus that number. So if you choose 6, it would be a 6/1, and if you choose 0, it would be a 0/7. Also, the errata has changed this to be pick a number between 7 and 0. So you could make it a 7-0 if you wanted it to die for some reason. Or more likely, you had a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a fun concept. I like the idea of this card. I think it's pretty cool, but it does kind of suck. It's 6 mana for this, and it can't trample or anything. It is big enough to be a problem for every creature that isn't Colossus Asardia, but I still don't think this card is good. It's probably fine in limited, but I'd be super wary of anything that costs more than 4 when the set has a 1 mana blow up any artifact card at common. This card is also a U1 rarity, so you aren't likely to see it. Yeah, I don't think this is good, but there are definitely situations where this would put in work, and the ability to change its power and toughness to suit the battlefield each turn is pretty handy. I do like Primal Clay better than Shapeshifter, though, because despite not being able to change your choice, you can give it flying, which is very useful. Realistically, Shapeshifter probably isn't worse than Primal Clay, at least not by much, but 6 mana really makes me hesitate with this. Also, I don't like this art. I think this is the only piece that was illustrated by Dan Frazier that I'm not a fan of. It just seems bad, I guess. Not that I could do any better, mind you, but yeah, I don't vibe with this piece. Up next is another actually playable card called Suchi. Suchi is a 4/4 that costs 4 mana, and when it dies, its controller adds 4 colorless mana. Su and Chi are the Mandarin and Taiwanese words for 4. So this card is just dripping with flavor, and I like it very much. How good this card is depends heavily on whether you're playing with mana burn or not. The 4 mana generated is meant to be a downside of sorts, because with mana burn, if you can't dump the mana to something, you'll be dealt 4 damage when this dies. Actually, this card sees a significant amount of play in Swedish Old School because they don't use mana burn, so practically every deck with any plan of aggro will run 4 copies of it, since it doesn't die to Lightning Bolt. In a limited environment, this is pretty solid. A 4/4 for 4 is kinda massive, and even with the risk of getting pinged with 4 damage, it's kinda worth it. Of course, you can always run one of the many artifacts or Mishra's Factory to dump the mana to avoid the damage, and then you're good to go. Suchi is a U3 as well, so it isn't too common, which is probably for the best because this card is pretty nuts. It's definitely better with no mana burn, but again, with proper setup, even the potential downside is easily mitigated. The art is also fantastic. This is another piece by the late great Christopher Rush, and it's fantastic. I love the harsh contrast of the colors, and the snake-like jaw is awesome. It's just a great art in my opinion. And the lore around Suchi is also pretty sweet. Sushi were Thrawn automatons that were notable for having backwards knees, and in the Brothers' War, the book, it's the first thing we hear about, as Tokesha is analyzing the skull of a sushi at the beginning of the book, before we even meet the brothers. There are many of them floating around in the early years, as parts of them are often found in archaeological dig sites. When the brothers first reach the cave of Kolios, a few still functioning Suchi are there and attempt to kill them for trespassing. Even their ability to give mana when destroyed is flavorful because each Suchi had a power stone embedded in it, and they were often ripped out of broken Suchi for use in other artifacts. But let's move on. Next we have Tetrabus, a U1 rarity 1/1 flying creature that costs 6 mana. That sounds bad, but there's more to it. Tetrabus enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and during your upkeep, you can move any number of +1/+1 counters off of Tetrabus, and each of those counters becomes a 1/1 flying artifact creature token that can't be enchanted. You may also exile any number of these tokens during your upkeep to put +1/+1 counters back onto Tetrabus. So this is a really cool card. I like this design space a lot, and it's so flavorful. Like, this is peak Magic design as far as stroking the imagination goes. You can do some pretty cool stuff with this, and it sort of reads as a card that gives you 4 1/1 flyers for 6 mana, which isn't the worst rate in the world. I like this card. I think it's fun, and I think stuff like this is what Magic is all about. It's not a particularly great card, It's fine in limited, and honestly, in most situations, I think I would advise splitting it up immediately so that you can at least partially dodge removal. But hey, your opponent has to run out of removal at some point. Again, it's not a great card, and I'd be surprised if people play this in Constructed, but damn, it is a cool card. I wish I had some fun lore to share with you about this, but the Tetravis was literally mentioned once in the Brothers War book, and I don't remember it showing up at all in the comic. The art is also fantastic, though. I love this art. Like, this just screams classic Magic card in all the best ways. Mark Teeden illustrated this masterpiece, and I love it. Triskelion is the next card we're going to talk about, and it's kind of similar to Tetravis in some respects. For one, they are both 1/1 creatures that cost 6, and they also both come into play with 3+1/+1 counters on them. And they are both U1 rarities. That is sort of where the similarities end, though, because Triskelion is way better. You can remove a counter at any time from Triskelion, and it will deal 1 damage to any target. This is especially useful in Limited because there are all those fairly valuable 1/1 creatures that will never attack, and with no creature removal in this set, pinging those creatures is your only way of removing them. 6 mana is pretty steep, but not outrageously steep for this effect. And you can always sack Triskelion after you use the counters, which ekes out a little bit more value from the exchange. This is a solid card, and one I'd be happy to have in hand should a serious problem arise. You can also just punch their face with the counters as well. This isn't likely to be the optimal play, but there are situations where 3 damage to the face is all you need, and there's an impossible board state preventing you from getting through. My kingdom for a lightning bolt, and all that jazz. Yeah, I like Triskelion. It even has a fun name to say. Triskelion. So cool. Triskelion was illustrated by Douglas Schuler, and while it's a little on the goofy side of magic art, I do really enjoy this piece. Then we have Urza's Avenger, which is our third imagining of a modular creature. This one is also a U1, making it a rare card to see, and it also costs 6 mana, which, as I've said, is a lot. Urza's Avenger is a 4/4, but you can activate its ability for free, and it will give Urza's Avenger -1 and either banding, flying, first strike, or trample until end of turn. And you can activate this ability more than once. So you could make it a flying banding 2/2, or first strike flying 2/2, or a trampling 3/3, or any other combination you can think of. This is pretty flavorful, and I do like the adaptability of it. 6 mana for a 4/4 hurts my soul though, especially since you have to give up power to give it the abilities. Which makes sense, but it does die to removal so easily, and 6 mana is fairly big investment. Less so in this limited environment than most, but we'll get to that when we cover the lands. This is better than Shapeshifter, I'll give it that, but 6 mana is a lot, and at best it can just hit your opponent in the face for like 3 or 2, which isn't nothing, but it's not as valuable as blowing up their creatures. I don't know. It's really cool, and I'd play it, but I don't think this card would be a game changer or anything like that. I do really enjoy the artwork for it, though. Urza's Avenger was illustrated by Amy Weber, and I love this design. It's super cool. As for the lore, the very first automaton that Urza ever built by himself was used to move a jade statue across the room to earn the hand of Kayla bin Krug, Princess of Krug, and also a book. He married her for the book, but that's not the point. This automaton would be modified throughout the years, but its first design was based off of the Thrawn artifact creatures known as Suchi. This very same automaton would be at the famed Peace Summit of Korlinda, where the warlord of Krug was killed by the Kadir of the Falaja, after the warlord unleashed a surprised attack during the peace conference. After the warlord was slain, Urza ordered his automaton to subdue the Kadir. But Mishra intervened, and the brothers' power stones blew up this creation. The people of Yosha would go on to posthumously name the creature Urza's Avenger. Also, he did eventually build a lot more of them. Up next is Wall of Spears. It's a wall, made of spears. It costs 3 mana and is a 3/4 that can't attack because it's a wall. It's also a U3 rarity, so you won't see these all over, but this card can be pretty annoying. especially in a limited environment. I honestly wouldn't even be too surprised to hear this sees some play in Constructed. It doesn't do anything if you're against a creatureless deck, but it can put some pressure on weenie aggro decks, and it's a decent enough stat line if your game plan doesn't require early aggression. In Limited, this is a decent enough piece. Its biggest problem is that it doesn't help you win the game, it just helps prevent you from losing the game. But if you have other cards that can help you win, there are many circumstances where just not losing for a while will be enough. The art for Wall of Spears was done by Sandra Everingham, and this might be my favorite piece of her art. Like, it's just fantastic. The skeleton is the best skeleton she's done in a card art, and the spears look fantastic. I just really enjoy the story this art tells. And it goes far to enhance the flavor of the card. And with that, we're on the last artifact creature, the last artifact, and the last non-land card. Yoshin Soldier is a 1/4 creature that costs 3 mana and has Vigilance, meaning attacking doesn't cause this to tap. It's also a C4 rarity, so these will be around. I really like this card. A 1/4 is really hard to deal with, save for the fact that it's an artifact. But it also having Vigilance is just sweet as hell. There are ways to pump attack in this set, so this could quickly become a problem in the right circumstances. That's not nothing. There's also nothing in this set that can kill Yoshin Soldier at or below the same casting cost. So if it comes down early, it's hard to deal with. You could potentially kill it with an Atog if you sack 2 artifacts to it, but that's a lot of resources to deal with a single card. Yeah, I really like this card. I think this is one of the better early game plays you could have in this limited environment. The art is also really sweet. That's a glass sword it's carrying, but it's like super magic glass or something. Maybe it's even tempered. I don't know. But it's a glass sword that works better than you'd expect. The late great Christopher Rush illustrated Yoshin Soldier, and it's fantastic. I enjoy the art and this card. Let's move on. And we are finally to the land cards of Antiquities, and much like Arabian Nights, some of the lands in this set are completely cracked and still see play. Unlike Arabian Nights, all of the lands from Antiquities are cracked, and they all still see play, at least somewhere. We're starting with a land so iconic they've made at least 10 different versions of this card, but arguably none of them are quite as efficient as Mishra's Factory. That's right, we're starting with Mishra's Factory, an OG card that's made waves in Pro Tours and is a control player's best friend. This land can either tap for colorless, or you can pay 1 mana to turn this card into a 2/2 Assembly Worker artifact creature that's still a land. Or you can tap it to give another Assembly Worker +1/+1 until end of turn. This card is awesome and incredibly versatile. For one, you can dump your extra mana into it to avoid mana burn. Secondly, it's a land drop that can be used to kill your opponent if all your cards are being used to blow up and counter their stuff. You can even pump it if you have multiple of these lands in play, which is likely to happen for a control player, slowing down the game. I remember when I first started playing and I saw a land like this, and I'll be honest, I didn't get it. Maybe I'm stupid, but it seemed so innocuous, and I felt like losing the land to creature removal seemed devastating. But it's a versatile and useful card. It still sees a lot of play in old school, and is genuinely a valuable piece. I do think Mishra's Factory suffers in this limited format, though. I still think it's highly playable, but the environment is harder to work through. This limited is mostly creatures and artifacts that are being blown up, and it's much harder to control the board in this limited than you'd find it to be in Constructed. The pieces just don't exist in this card pool to make that reliable. It's still a solid card, though, and I'd grab this up for sure. This is a fairly rare card to find, though, at least in draft, which is surprising because there are 4 versions of this card. Most of the lands in this set got 4 distinct versions of art, and Mishra's Factory is no different. This card features a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter version. And the spring version, also known as Mishra's Factory A, appeared once on the common sheet, or C1, which means it showed up as often as cards that were printed 3 times on the uncommon sheet. Mishra's Factory B, C, and D, however, showed up only once on the uncommon sheet, making them significantly more rare. All four of these art pieces were illustrated by Kaja and Phil Folio. We've talked about Kaja Folio quite a bit, but this is the first set of cards we've seen where Phil Folio contributed. I like Phil's work. Some people don't like his art, and I can see where they're coming from, but I enjoy the whimsical nature every card he touches has. I think Kaja makes more impressive art, but I think Phil makes more joyful art. They are both fantastic artists, though. And it's pretty cute they worked on these cards together. I'm not even sure which of these versions is my favorite. Most people seem to prefer the winter version, and it's beautiful, but I think I'm partial to the fall version. But honestly, I really like them all. Next up is Mishra's Workshop, and wowzers is this a fucking magic card. Mishra's Workshop only has one copy on the uncommon sheet, and unlike the other lands, only one artwork exists for the card. But man, this card is pretty brutal. If you see this in Limited, you really have no excuse for not drafting this. Mishra's Workshop is the only land that Wizards have ever had the balls to print that taps for 3 mana. There are some Lotus-style lands, but those require you to sack lands to play. Mishra's Workshop's only restriction is that you may only use this mana to cast artifacts. That's a real downside, especially in a set that's like half artifacts. Seriously, this card goes insane, but you likely don't need me to tell you that. I love this card. It still sees play in vintage shop decks as far as I know. I haven't kept up with vintage results or deck lists in a long while, but vintage shop with Karn was oppressive for a while at least. A lot of cards have come out since then though, so maybe I'm wrong. Workshop is such an insane card though, and it's such a unique effect. Like there's no real replacement for this card. There is stuff like Ancient Tomb or Crystal Vein or City of Traders that are sort of similar, but there is a world of difference between 2 and 3 mana when you tap a land. This card is nuts. It's probably one of my favorite cards, just for how insane it is. The first time I learned this card existed, it blew my mind. I was infatuated with it. I don't even really know what to say about this card as far as strategy goes. Like, play it and get 3 land drops for 1 for your artifacts. It's just really good, right? The art is pretty sweet too. This one took a while for it to grow on me since it's so blacked out, and I didn't realize it was a burnt out tree stump, like Mishra's factory, but aged and used, and the surrounding landscape has been made barren by the march of innovation. So I do really enjoy the artwork. Kaja Folio illustrated this, and it's wonderful. Okay, Strip Mine. Strip Mine is nuts. This is another card that they've tried to fix multiple times over the years, and every time the new version of it is a little worse. Now the newest strip mine that I know of won't let you kill a basic and gives your opponents a basic, because apparently getting strip mined isn't fun for most people. Which I can see, I guess, but I love this card, and I think it adds to the game. Oh yeah, I haven't said what strip mine does. Strip mine can tap for a colorless, or you can tap and sack it to destroy one target land. Strip mine is a sweet card. It's also really good against lands that are really good. And what does Antiquities have? Lands that are really, really good. That being said, it's as rare as Mishra's Factory for the same reasons. There are 4 different arts for Strip Mine, which may surprise some of you because look at these. If you never saw 2 in the same place, how would you have any idea that there were multiple arts? They all look practically the same. All these cards have the same rarities as Mishra's Factory. Strip Mine A appears once on the common sheet, while B, C, and D all appear once on the uncommon sheet. It's also funny because Strip Mine was designed as a way to check Library of Alexandria, but they printed it into a set with a bunch of other lands that are really good as well. Also, it's really good with Library of Alexandria. Kind of made more problems than it solved, but I actually like the power level of Strip Mine. Many people disagree, and that's completely cool. The nice thing about such an expansive card pool is that you can really trim down the experience to exactly what you're looking for. Anyway, Strip Mine was illustrated by Daniel Gellin, and I do enjoy the art of this card despite it being bland and all four versions just sort of looking like different perspectives of the same hole in the ground. These are different mines, though, or different directions of the same mine, I guess is a possibility. I don't know. If I had to pick a favorite, it's probably version B. I like the bit of sky to juxtapose the depression. Huh, wordplay. Anyway, let's move on to the last three lands. Alright, I'm gonna talk about these next three lands together, and I'm pretty sure you understand why. If not, you will soon enough. Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower are all lands that tap for a colorless mana. However, if you control an Urza's Mine, an Urza's Power Plant, and an Urza's Tower, these lands instead tap for 7 mana total. Urza's Mine and Urza's Power Plant both tap for 2, and Urza's Tower taps for 3. That's pretty good. Getting 7 mana from 3 lands is more than you would usually get for 3 lands. But there aren't many people that play Magic that haven't at least heard of a Tron deck. For example, Modern has, at various times, had a meta suitable for Urzatron, as it's usually called. That being said, Modern has a lot of tools that don't exist within the old school card pool. Its better creatures and better searching methods are the main reasons. But how are these in Limited? Well, to answer that question, we have to ask how likely are you to even have multiple copies of these lands? Because if there is only one of each of these, it'll be very hard to even get all three, much less assemble it during a game. There are 4 distinct arts for each of these cards, which means there are at least 4 copies. But let's dig into the rarities, shall we? We'll start with Urza's Mine. The 4 arts on Urza's Mine were illustrated by Anson Maddox. Urza's Mine A has the most boring art, but it's detailed and I do like it. I appreciate the fraying rope. That's a cool detail. Urza's Mine A shows up on the common sheet a single time, so that means it's about as rare as a U3. Urza's Mine B has Yoda hanging out in a minecart. What is he doing there? I've never noticed that. Anyway, B is also on the single sheet one time, again making it about as rare as an uncommon. Urza's Mine C appears twice on the common sheet, making it twice as likely to appear as A or B. The art is pretty cool too, but this is probably my least favorite art on the Urza Mines. Urza Mine D has probably my favorite art, and it also appears on the common sheet twice. So, Urza's Mine appears on the common sheet 6 times in total. And if you were to have enough packs to have one of every card off the uncommon sheet, that means you would have 3 common sheets roughly. Which means, for every card that appeared on the uncommon sheet once, there were 18 Urza Mines floating about. That's pretty common, all things considered. But let's take a look at Urza's Power Plant. Urza's Power Plant is much the same as Urza's Mine. A and B are C2, while C and D are C1, giving it the same number of cards. That makes sense. So let's talk about the art for a bit. The 4 versions of Urza's Power Plant were all done by Mark Teeden. Power Plant A looks pretty cool and has some fun details, but it's probably my least favorite. Power Plant B has the most iconic art in my opinion, and I love this art a lot. It's very cool, both in the scale it shows and just the concept of a magical power plant. Power Plant C is also high up on my list. It shows some sort of bug getting drained for energy, or possibly having some energy pumped into it. I guess I can't really determine the direction of flow. I don't really know why you would do that, but I do enjoy the whimsy and the mystery of this particular version. And version D has copper piping and some type of boiler, which is also really cool. I really like how the power plant arts seem to just be showing different parts of the same process. Or maybe it's different ways of generating energy. I don't know. I'm not a Teresian electrical engineer, but I do enjoy the art. Urza's Tower, however, is a little different. First off, as we discussed, it makes 3 mana instead of 2. but it also has different rarities. Urza's Tower A is a C2, but Urza's Tower B, C, and D are all C1. So instead of there being 6 copies per sheet, there are only 5, which would mean that there are 15 copies of it instead of 18 of the other two. But that's still a decent amount of Urza's Tower floating around. I would say it's not guaranteed to be able to draft an Urzatron deck, but it's certainly possible to do so, which is neat, but it's pretty likely to not be a great strategy. You'd also have to secure cards that slowed down your opponent while you dug for your 3-card land combo. That being said, there are ways to dig in this set, there just aren't ways to gain card advantage. Point is, you could potentially get this going, but I do think the best strategy would be to focus on a more reliable game plan and work on this on the side. Especially since the smartest play is probably to grab a couple of these when there's nothing else you need, if only to deny someone going hard in on making the Tron lands work. Strip Mine also exists in the set, but at least there are other juicy targets for Strip Mine as well, making it a little bit easier to get over it. But let's talk about the art for a bit. So Urza's Tower was illustrated by Mark Poole, and this is just some fantastic work. Like, I love all 4 of these arts. A is probably my favorite because it reminds me of home, but I also really love the art on B. The sunset and the shadows are just glorious. Just seems peaceful and serene. Urza's Tower C is probably the weakest of the 4 for me, but it's still a fantastic piece. The clouds and the blue sky are just so inviting, and the planes are well done. I just find fields boring. Then the art for D is also sweet as hell, but it's also not my favorite. The mountains are nice, but it feels cold and doesn't hit my soul the same way that A or B do. Still, every art for Tower is fantastic. But there we go. We've finished up talking about every card in Antiquities. So I guess let's go over my final thoughts. This set was obviously not built with draft in mind, but it is less obvious than it was with Arabian Nights. I think this set actually does hold a pretty solid draft experience inside it. It's far from as balanced and polished as modern design is, but like, no shit, right? Still, I think it's playable, and what's more, I think it's fun. A lot of the cards in this set suck hard because they only care about artifacts. But in a set that's practically only artifacts, these cards are actually pretty damn sweet. And some of them even take up unique roles that you won't find in constructed play. And they do it with some of the more unique mechanics that we've seen. A lot of these cards are just fun and interesting. And on top of that, there is a whole world of lore to stoke the imagination, as well as a comic book that's not really good in my opinion. Well, I didn't like it anyway. And there are some other books that are not great. I wasn't able to get through Song of Time while doing my research because I just thought the writing sucked. Plus, it's not canon anymore after the Brothers' War retconned a bunch of it. So it just didn't seem worth it to try to power through. The Brothers' War, by the way, was absolutely fantastic. I managed to read it twice in a week and a half while researching for this video and for the lore video that I also made. Yeah, that's out too, by the way. If you didn't see it yet, you should check my channel for it. As I said earlier, I was just going to add a section to the beginning of this video to go over it briefly, but there is just so much of relevance that happens in 500 pages that I finished writing the overview, and then when I recorded it, it was long. So I decided to chop that into its own video so as not to bloat what is already an incredibly bloated video. Also, I know not everyone is interested in having the story summarized at them because I made a poll about it. People wanted lore, but not everyone wanted the whole story shoved into a set review. And after gathering all my thoughts about it, I don't blame them. But if you do enjoy that video and that format, let me know. If I have to go through all this research just to point out some fun things about a couple cards, I'll still do it, but it would be a giant waste of time to not at least get another video out of it. Oh, yeah, final thoughts about the set. Sorry, I'm blithering like a moron. The set rocks. I definitely recommend either slapping together a cube or printing out a bunch of proxies to set up a draft experience, because either one would be insanely awesome. It's such a cool set, dripping in lore and mechanical cohesion. It probably goes too far, as literally every card cares about artifacts or is an artifact, and some generic removal would have gone a long way, but I still think it's playable enough, and will be an entirely different experience than what you're used to. Anyway, that's all I have for you today, assuming you had watched the lore video. Otherwise, go check that out if you want. But either way, thank you for watching. I appreciate you making it to the end, and if you have any comments or criticisms, I'd love to hear about it down below in the comments. A like would also be nice. I'd appreciate that, but doesn't matter. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope you have a magical day.